Chapter 2021. Meg had obtained today's secret report from the secret tree hole, and after some slight modifications and embellishments, he used the 100 transformation mask to change his face. He sold this latest intelligence report to a few paid intelligence agencies in Rodu, and at the same time he gave a free copy to all of the storytellers in the tea houses. In less than an afternoon, the second prince, Josh, had sold his soul to the devil, waged war against the outside world, and murdered his ministers and their families. His crimes were unpardonable, and His Majesty had already issued an order to depose him from his position as a prince. Thus, news of him being arrested and apologized to all of the people who had died tragically spread throughout Rodu. Such explosive news sent shockwaves through the entire royal court. On the other hand, this news signified that the battle for the throne that had been going on for over a decade had most likely already come to an end. Josh had chosen to sell his soul to the devil, which meant that he had been eliminated from the battle for the throne, and First Prince Sean would become the only successor to the throne. Within the First Prince's manor, Josh, that idiot, was eliminated by himself in the end. What a waste of effort. Sean looked at the intelligence report he had just received with a smug smile on his face. He was undoubtedly the one who had benefited the most from this incident. Initially, he was still grieving over Bloom's death. After all, Bloom was his greatest ally, but he had suddenly died. However, judging from the current situation, his death was very worthwhile. He had taken Josh down into the abyss with him, and he would never be able to rise again. Your Highness, the royal palace hasn't released any information on this yet, so we'll have to treat this report with caution, one of his subordinates reminded. A smile appeared on Sean's face, and he said, "As long as this news has spread, then it's the truth. From this day forth, Josh is dead." Abraham listened to the butler's report, and he was so shocked that he couldn't close his mouth for a long time. "Master, should I prepare a carriage for you to enter the palace?" the butler asked in a quiet voice. Abraham pondered in silence for a moment before shaking his head. "There's no need for that. His Majesty didn't summon me into the palace, nor did he officially announce this to the world. This is most likely just a rumor. Pass down my order that no one in the Duke's manor is allowed to discuss this matter. Anyone who disobeys my orders will be expelled immediately." The butler left with his orders, and Abraham began to pace around the hall with a troubled expression. That shouldn't be the case. No matter how you look at it, Josh still had a 50% chance of winning this battle. Why would he do something so stupid before His Majesty made a decision? If Vanessa knew about this, she would definitely die. Sigh. Youngsters nowadays, I really don't understand them. Seems like we're not the only ones keeping an eye on this, Douglas said in surprise as he looked at the information in his hand. Douglas was very Douglas's Douglas, Joshua and Sean and Lord's actions as he, Douglas and His Majesty and their methods most likely and in his, and SS, their plan. Josh the done so. Fire Bloom, S's was done so, and all twos SSSSSSS news, woods, and nothing but this had to. Without doing anything the news and the news to be spread of to be of. Since the fire has already started, let's create another storm, Douglas smirked. Not long after, an open letter in the name of the giant dragons was sent to the Rodu royal palace and spread across the Norland continent. In this letter, the giant dragons condemned Andre for harboring Josh, who was controlled by the devil, and for colluding with the devil. He allowed Josh to start a war against the orcs and elves, and for wantonly killing the officials and their innocent family members in Rodu, and for trying to start a new racial war. Furthermore, in this letter, the giant dragons even gave Andre an ultimatum. They requested Andre to capture Josh as soon as possible so that he could give everyone an explanation. If the rumors circulating in the day were said to have limited influence, then this open letter from the giant dragons was like a heavy bomb that tore apart all pretense. The second prince had turned into a devil and was wantonly massacring people in Rodu. The people's hearts were in turmoil. This assist is so professional. Meg looked at the open letter he had just received and was a little surprised. This attack was tantamount to announcing Josh's social death. No matter how he tried to clear his name in the future with such a stain, unless he controlled everyone, he would never be able to become the king of the Roth Empire again. He could already imagine how furious Andre or Josh would be when they received this news. We started the show, and the show went on by itself. The effect is better than we expected, Irina said with a smile as she looked at the letter in Meg's hand. The devil made the Norland continent feel threatened, and as the second prince of the Roth Empire, Josh sold his soul to the devil. Now, public opinion would force Andre to investigate this matter thoroughly and cut off all ties with Josh. It was foreseeable that an anti-Johnson alliance would be formed soon. Andre had completely lost the legitimacy and initiative to start a war. He might even have to consider how to prove that the Edward royal family had not completely fallen and become the devil's servant. Not bad. Meg kept the open letter in his hand. He looked at Irina with a smile and said, "I'm in a good mood today, so let's have a good meal. You can order whatever you want to eat." "I want to eat yolk cake, roast meat, roast pig's eyes, roast fish." Amy popped her head out from behind the counter and was the first to say her name. "Then let's have a barbecue feast. I'll go and prepare." Meg walked to the kitchen with a smile. It felt so good to give someone a taste of their own medicine. "You lied to me. Things are not like what you said at all. I have nothing now." Outside Rodu, in a dark cave, a furious voice reverberated in the empty cave. The faint light cast an illusionary shadow of the black-robed figure on the wall. The shadow slowly squirmed, and many tentacles sprouted from its body. "There are no issues with the implementation of the plan, and the war has already begun. You've gained your current power through that resentment, but there are some bad guys who ruined our plan. You have to find them and kill them, and I'll help you. Everything in this world will be yours, and everyone will submit to you." A hoarse voice sounded within the cave, and the black shadow also began to sway slightly. "Kill them?" Josh chuckled in despair. "They just want to lure me out to kill me, so how am I supposed to kill them? Even you were resealed by Alex. I have nothing now, and you're the culprit behind all of this. I shouldn't have trusted you. I shouldn't have trusted you. Who else can you trust aside from me? Relax. Everything has only just begun." The shadow's voice gradually became gentler. All of a sudden, the shadow on the wall pounced toward Josh, and it transformed into wisps of black mist that flowed into his body. The shadow on the wall swayed, and a series of tentacles could be seen burrowing into Josh's head before completely disappearing. "Now, I am you, and you are me." Chapter 2022. As night fell, Romo Street was as desolate as ever. Occasionally, there were nostalgic guests who came to look around, but looking at the withered long street and the rare restaurants and taverns, they didn't have much impulse to go into the shops. This situation had lasted for a year, and the remaining businesses had begun to consider the issue of closing. They would starve to death if they relied on love to generate electricity. Sir Lucian, it seems that there are not many taverns left on Romo Street except for the Titan Tavern, but they are too noisy. Let's change places. Several officials of the Ministry of War followed Lucian as they walked on Romo Street. An official said, "Yeah, I haven't been here for a year. I didn't expect it to be so desolate. No matter what, it was the first choice for eating, drinking, and playing around in the past." There were also officials who said with some emotion, "I'll take you to a good place. Except for Romo Street, you can't find a second place anywhere else." Lucian said with a smile. The officials were a little surprised when they heard the words. Sir Lucian called several of their colleagues from the Ministry of War out to drink today. Recently, major events had happened one after another. They had nothing to do now, and they were in a bad mood. Naturally, they would gladly go to the appointment. "Speaking of it, Bobby brought me to this place." Lucian looked at Bobby standing at the edge and said, "It turned out to be a place recommended by Sir Bobby. There must be good wine." The officials were thoughtful. At the same time, they kept their thoughts. Everyone in the Ministry of War knew that Hector and Bobby were close friends. They often drank together on weekdays. The relationship between Lucian and Hector was also quite close. Now that Hector was gone, Lucian and Bobby were quite close. Today, several officials of the Ministry of War came out to drink together. With Bobby's official position and identity, he was generally not invited, but he was brought by Lucian. It was inevitable that people would think a little more. The day before yesterday, I happened to come across this newly opened tavern and tasted the good wine. So I dared to bring you to taste it, Bobby quickly said humbly. His official position was the lowest here. This time, Lucian brought him here probably with the intention of guiding him. He naturally had to perform well. Not long after, the group arrived at the door of Saipan Tavern. The ministers were surprised that a new tavern had opened here, but since Lucian had brought them here, they naturally did not say much and followed him into the tavern. This was a new tavern, but the furnishings and decorations were very simple and did not appear luxurious at all. It was very different from the taverns they usually frequented. However, after what had happened in the past few days, they really had no intention of going to the tavern to drink and have fun. They just wanted to find a quiet place to drink, chat, and relieve the depression in their hearts. "Oh, we have customers again," Amy said as she poked her head out from behind the counter and looked curiously at the group of people who had just entered. "Wow, what a cute little girl." Everyone's eyes lit up as they looked at the little guy who looked like he was carved out of jade. They couldn't help but smile. "Hello, everyone," Amy greeted them with a smile, looking obedient and cute. "Hello, young lady," Lucian said with a smile. He had a very good impression of this tavern, and he had enjoyed himself to the fullest last night. After returning home, he had a rare good night's sleep. He felt refreshed when he woke up this morning. If it wasn't for the news of Bloom being killed, he would feel that it was a very good day. Meg came out of the kitchen when he heard the sound. He glanced at Bobby, and the corner of his mouth raised slightly. This person is simply the bartender of the tavern. He brings people to drink every 2 or 3 days, and the scale is getting bigger and bigger. He really does his best. "What would you like to drink?" Meg asked in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. He was not intimidated by the official robes and official aura of this group of people. Lucian glanced at the 8 of them who came this time. He thought for a moment and said, "Give me 3 bottles of Moutai wine and a bottle of whiskey to try. Give me 2 servings of each side dish. By the way, give me 2 more servings of drunkard's peanuts." "Okay, please wait a moment." Meg nodded and turned into the kitchen. "This boss is interesting. When we went to eat and drink in the past, those bosses were all flattering and fawning on us. He is not in a hurry at all." A minister said with a smile, "Yeah, this boss looks very young. Can he really brew good wine?" There were also ministers who were puzzled. Maybe it's his personality, but the wine brewed by this boss is indeed good wine. Bobby explained with a smile. Everyone chose a seat inside and sat down. As they chatted, they talked about the assassination of Bloom. Seeing that there was no one in the tavern, only a little girl playing behind the wine cabinet, and the boss was also busy in the kitchen, they avoided the important matters and focused on the trivial matters. Bloom was a military general, but he did not hold a position in the Ministry of War. He was estranged from the officials, so his death was far less impactful than the death of several ministers in the Ministry of War and the extermination of their family. However, other news brought out by this assassination incident made them fearful and fearful. If the person who killed Bloom was really the second prince, Joshua, then the murderer who slaughtered their colleagues' families was most likely Joshua too. Those ministers had their families massacred because Joshua was imprisoned before they could clear their names. As a result, several of them could not bear it and committed suicide in the prison. Lucian was in a high position and this matter was very sensitive. After just a few words, Lucian changed the topic and changed the topic. "Your wine and dishes. Please enjoy." Meg quickly served the wine and dishes to everyone, and then tactfully retreated. "What kind of style is this? It's quite unique." Looking at the 3 round Moutai bottles and the whiskey in the slender crystal bottle, everyone's eyes lit up. With everyone's status, they naturally drank a lot of good wine, but there were not many taverns that would spend so much effort on the bottles. "This is Moutai, the most delicious wine I have ever tasted." Bobby picked up a bottle of Moutai and skillfully opened the cap. A thick aroma of wine instantly wafted out. "This aroma!" The minister's eyes lit up, and those who loved wine couldn't help but take a deep breath of the wine. Just by smelling the aroma, I know it's a rare good wine. I didn't expect that there would be such a good wine hidden in a newly opened tavern on Romo Street. A minister exclaimed. Bobby took a few glasses and filled them up for each minister one by one. I'm not drinking Mautai today. I want to try this so-called whiskey. Lucian refused Bobby's offer to pour him wine and picked up the bottle of whiskey on the table instead. Such a crystal bottle was rare. Even if it was sold separately, it could be sold at a good price for Meg. However, the boss used it to store wine. It was worth 2,000 copper coins for a bottle of wine. This crystal bottle alone was definitely worth it. Let me open the bottle for you. Meg came at the right time and took the whiskey from Lucian's hand. He first removed the cap and then pulled out the cork with the bottle opener. Please enjoy. Meg put down the whiskey. Chapter 2023. The cork of the bottle was opened, and the aroma of wine slowly drifted out. Lucian, who was originally looking forward to it, slowly frowned. He picked up the bottle and poured himself a glass. He put the glass in front of his nose and sniffed it. Then he looked at Meg and said, Boss, is your wine burnt? Yeah, there is a smell of smoke. A person next to him also nodded. Although it wasn't bad, it was a smell that shouldn't appear in wine. Several ministers' faces suddenly pulled down. They came out to drink, and no one dared to fool them with bad things. This boss was not kind. Bobby looked at Meg. He had a good impression of the boss, but if there was a problem with the wine, he really had to explain it clearly. This is not burnt. It is the unique burnt aroma and smoke smell of whiskey. Without this smoke smell, it would lose its soul. Meg explained slowly, of course, some people will like this smell, and some people can't accept it, but this has nothing to do with being burnt. Aren't you fooling us? A minister frowned, and his official prestige was revealed. He was faintly angry. Whiskey and Mautai are made by ingenuity in my heart. How can I fool you? Why don't you taste it yourself? If you don't like it, just don't drink it. Meg was neither servile nor overbearing. Lucian raised his hand slightly and motioned to the accompanying officials not to be angry. He looked at Meg and smiled. I believe that the person who can brew such a good wine as Mautai will not lie. I will try the taste of this wine first and see if it suits my taste. As Lucian spoke, he picked up the glass and took a sip of whiskey. His brows frowned first, then his eyebrows raised slightly, showing a bit of surprise. Then his frowning brows gradually eased, and finally he showed a smile. When the wine entered his mouth, it tasted dry and mellow, and a faint smoky taste drifted in his mouth, bringing a trace of a psychedelic feeling. The faint charred fragrance wasn't pungent or unpleasant, but instead added a layer to the wine's fragrance. This was a different feeling from the pure and extreme aroma of Mautai. He was so unique, but he maintained an amazing high standard. He was also an outstanding wine. The wine swirled in his mouth and slid down his throat. The fragrance lingered in his mouth for a long time. Lucian knew that he had fallen in love with this bottle of whiskey. It was so special and so surprising. Only after tasting it could he know the wonderful taste hidden under the deceptive fragrance. Good wine. What a good wine. Lucian slowly opened his eyes and looked at Meg apologetically. Boss, we were too reckless. This is a fine wine that can be compared to Mautai. Please enjoy. Meg nodded slightly and turned to leave. This time, it was Bobby and the others' turn to be surprised. Sir Meg, is this wine really that good? The minister who had previously scolded Meg asked in disbelief. You will know after you have a glass. Lucian smiled and picked up the empty glass beside him and poured a glass for him. Okay, since Sir said it is good, then I will also try a glass. The minister took a sip of the wine glass. He also frowned, and then his eyes lit up. He looked down at the wine glass in his hand in surprise, and then looked at Lucian. He swallowed the wine and savored the aftertaste. Then, he nodded in admiration and said, It is really a good wine. I didn't expect such a fine wine to be hidden in this small tavern. Didn't Lord Cadora say that the wine was a joke? Lucian joked. Cadora smiled awkwardly and said in the direction of the wine cabinet, Boss, don't mind me. I am a straightforward person. Your wine is indeed a good wine. It's okay, as long as the customer is satisfied. Meg responded, do you want to try it? Lucian looked at the other ministers and asked, I am already craving for this Mautai wine. I am afraid this wine is more to my taste. Let's try this first. Yes. I have never smelled such a fragrant wine. I have already poured it. Let's try this first. The others showed greater interest in the Mautai wine in front of them. Okay, the wine and dishes have been served. Let's not be restrained. Let's drink. Lucian picked up the wine glass and reminded them with a smile. Let me remind you that this wine is amazing. It is very strong. Drink it slowly. Then, sounds of admiration sounded in the tavern. Whether it was the Mautai wine or the whiskey, they all brought great surprise to everyone. This table of people brought some of the liveliness that a tavern should have in the usually quiet tavern. Opening a tavern is indeed much easier than opening a restaurant. I have entered the wrong line of work. Meg sat behind the counter and watched the two little guys play checkers on the small bench while listening to the group of old men chatting. Reminder to the host. Please increase the popularity of the tavern as soon as possible. Current popularity of the tavern. 8. Set a small goal of 1,000 popularity first. Do your best. Godfather. Daddy is very comfortable when you call me Daddy. Meg nodded. Daddy will work hard. TSK? TSK. Scram. The system roared. Mag ignored the system's roar and said, That's good. Look at how happy these people are chatting. After drinking a few glasses of wine, they dare to talk about anything. If other customers were here, they wouldn't dare to listen. Don't forget you have bought half a street. The system reminded. Meg frowned and realized that things were not simple. This investment was going to be a huge loss. Whiskey and Mautai were both high-alcohol wines. For these people who usually drank fruit wine with low alcohol content, it was even more so. The first few glasses were drunk while they were in high spirits. After a few glasses and a few peanuts, they were stunned. Meg did not have any other hobbies recently. He liked to chat with the customers when they were drunk. For example, Bloom, who was killed by them last night, how the officials were feeling recently, and what they thought of Joshua. Even the Grey Temple's intelligence system could not collect such first-hand information. After calling the coachman of the officials to carry the drunk officials away, Meg flipped the wooden sign on the door and announced the end of business for the day. Joshua was finished. The smear was successful and the effect was obvious. Now, Joshua was no different from the devil in the eyes of the officials of the Ministry of War. They wanted to kill him as soon as possible to avenge the families of the innocent officials who died tragically. Moreover, they had decided that they would jointly write a letter tomorrow asking the king to investigate the matter and bring the murderer to justice. How promising! Meg generously waived the cost of a serving of peanuts for the drunkard. Chapter 2024. When you feel that life isn't going your way, don't panic. Just feel your empty wallet and cry. Meg said calmly to the middle-aged man sitting at the door of his tavern and looking at the lively Titan Tavern across the street. The man looked back at Meg with some bitterness. His mouth moved and his eyes glistened with tears. From his clothes, although he wasn't rich, he definitely wasn't a homeless person. However, one thing was for sure. He definitely didn't have enough money to buy a glass of wine. But he didn't want to go home. That was why he was sitting in front of a tavern and looking at another tavern. Their excitement has nothing to do with me, because I don't have money. If a man doesn't have money in his pocket, he just can't straighten his back. Meg sighed faintly. He took out a few gold coins from his pocket and tossed them in his hand. The man's expression became even more bitter. He glanced at the gold coins in Meg's hand and looked away angrily. Judging from his body size, he wasn't confident that he could snatch the gold coins from the cheap tavern owner. After a moment of silence, the man looked back at Meg. I have a story, you have wine. Sorry, I'm not interested. Meg shook his head slightly. Man, pie, however, since you're so interested in the tavern across the street, why don't you go sit at the door across the street? Meg asked curiously. There are so many people there. Do you think I don't care about my reputation? Also, it's quite warm here. The man glanced at him, still angry. Oh, I see. Meg thought for a moment and then felt offended. What? Do you think there's no one here? Also, there's a heater? It's quite cold outside today. Meg stomped his feet. Although the heater in the room made the door a little warmer, it couldn't withstand the bleak cold wind. Yes, it would be nice if there was a place to sit. The man rubbed his hands and nodded. He looked at Meg expectantly. The steps are quite flat. I'll leave a bigger gap for you. Meg smiled generously and opened the door a crack. Warm air blew out from the tavern. Thank you. The man nodded with difficulty. You're welcome. Meg waved his hand generously and turned to enter the tavern. Sigh. Pass aside and tightened his little cotton-padded jacket. Men were too difficult. He was a long-distance carriage driver with more than 20 years of experience. He had been to many places as a long-distance transport driver for the trading company. However, he had just lost his job today. The boss said that there might be a war, and the trade route was blocked. He didn't know when it would be restored, so he told the coachman to go home. This month's salary could only be received in 2 days. Even if he received his salary from the boss, he had to give it to his wife immediately. Of course, he wasn't afraid of his wife. He just respected her. Yes, that was it. There were 3 children at home. They were all growing up. With his salary, he could barely make ends meet. After sitting for a while, Passa was ready to get up and go home. He had already thought about it. He would look for a job tomorrow. Even if he couldn't be a coachman, he could find other jobs. At least he couldn't let his wife and children starve. Have a drink? At this time, a familiar voice came from behind. Passa turned around and looked at Meg, who was holding a small stool and a tray in his hand. Meg put the tray on the small stool. There was a plate of drunkard's peanuts and half a bottle of Moutai wine left by the group of people. Because there were too many people, Meg didn't know who to pack it for, so he could only dispose of it like this. Meg and Passa sat on the steps across the small stool. The door behind them was completely open. The warm air blew from behind, blowing away the cold air. Pop! Meg uncorked the bottle and poured the wine into 2 glasses. Good wine. Passa smelled the wine and his eyes suddenly lit up. He didn't like wine, but all the coachmen would drink wine in winter to keep warm. After traveling for so many years, he had also drunk wine from all over the world, but he had never smelled such wine. Good taste. Meg poured 2 glasses of wine, reached out and picked up a glass. He looked at Passa and said, Come on, let's toast to this bullshit life. To this bullshit life. Passa also picked up his glass, gently touched it, and then drank it. This was a good wine that Passa had never drunk in his life. When the wine entered his stomach, a warmth rose from the bottom of his heart. It came from the warmth brought by the wine, but also from a stranger who handed him a glass of wine in the cold wind. Drunkard's peanuts, try it. Meg picked up a peanut and threw it into his mouth, chewing it crisply. Passa also picked up a peanut and put it into his mouth. He was surprised that these ordinary peanuts had become so crispy and spicy. He couldn't help but want another glass of wine. Meg filled his glass again, but this time he wasn't in a hurry to drink with him. This wasn't beer. If he drank 1 glass after another, half a bottle would be gone. Furthermore, if this guy was drunk, he didn't know what to do. I'm a coachman and I've been to many places. The Twilight Forest, the Wind Forest, Chaos City. I've been to all of them, but I haven't been to the Demon Islands. I heard that demons eat people and you have to take a boat, so I haven't been there. Passa and Meg chatted, but he didn't talk about his sad life. Instead, he talked about what he had seen and heard during his years as a coachman on the Norland continent. Meg listened carefully most of the time. He was listening to a coachman's view of the world and the world. This was a very interesting experience. At least, he didn't have this kind of experience often in his life. He was looking at a normal person who was seriously living his life. Thank you for the wine. I'll come and drink with you again when I have money in my pocket. Next time, it's my treat. Passa was a little tipsy, and he looked at Meg with a serious expression. All right, it's your treat next time. Meg nodded with a smile. He hung the packaged drunkard's peanuts around Passa's waist. There were also 3 candies inside. He had heard from Passa that he had 3 children at home. Goodbye. Passa waved his hand and swayed away. Meg stood at the door and looked on as Passa disappeared into the street. He made sure that Passa could go home on his own before turning off the signboard light. This guy is really a strange person. At the entrance of the Titan Tavern, AI Faye's brows furrowed in confusion. "Lady boss, give me another bottle of wine." A shout came from the tavern. "Coming." AI Faye hurriedly pushed open the door and continued to busy herself. "Where did you go this time? You don't even come back for dinner. You've grown a lot, haven't you?" A sturdy woman was standing at the door of an old house. Watching Passa wobbling towards her, she raised her voice at once while holding a wooden slipper in her hand. 3 little heads poked out from the back of the house and looked at Passa with pity in their eyes. Chapter 2025. Who are you? Where's my precious Clara? I'm telling you, she's the most beautiful and wonderful woman in the world. Don't stop me from going home," Passa said seriously as he wobbled over before falling into the woman's arms. "Idiot." A shy smile appeared on the woman's face. She patted his butt lightly with the wooden slippers in her hand before helping Passa into the house. "Sit down. I'll boil some water for you to wash your feet," Clara said as she placed Passa on the bed. "Boss Hades didn't lie to me. A man can drink until he's 70% drunk and act until you cry." Passa opened his eyes to take a glance and praised in his heart. "Father, are you peeking at Mother secretly?" A little head came over, followed by 2 more little heads. "Shoo. Father brought you delicious food." Passa took out the peanuts and candies that Mr. Mack had packed for him and passed them to the 3 children. "Okay." The 3 children took the bag and went to the side to eat happily. Meg closed the door and ended the day's business. No one could find Josh now, but the net had been cast, and the sea was full of fishermen. As long as he still wanted to come out and stir up trouble, he would be caught sooner or later. Given his understanding of Josh, there was no way he would give up after doing so many things after seeing the situation on the Norland continent become so dangerous. Hence, all he had to do now was wait for him to jump out or come to find him. Meg turned off the lights outside the door and was about to go upstairs when he turned around to find Irina and the 2 little ones sitting neatly behind a table, looking at him. "What, do you want supper?" Meg asked with a smile. He thought they were already asleep. "Supper. Of course, that's fine too." Amy nodded without hesitation. "Hot pot is good," Irina said, and nodded. "Meow, meow." Ugly Duckling also stood up from the chair at the side and agreed. "Okay, I'll go prepare the ingredients. Let's eat hot pot." Meg smiled and walked towards the kitchen. "By the way, Mother, aren't we looking for Father to discuss how to improve the tavern's business?" Amy turned to look at Irina, blinked, and asked. "It's okay. Eating hot pot won't affect our conversation," Irina said with a smile. "Oh." Amy nodded thoughtfully. Her 2 short legs dangled in the air, and she suddenly jumped to the ground. She ran to the kitchen door and looked at Meg, who was preparing the ingredients, and said, "Father, I want to eat youtiao, the kind that is cooked in a hot pot." "Okay, but it will take some time to make the youtiao. It will take a while," Meg promised. "Yes, there's no hurry. Father, you're the best." Amy nodded her little head. She ran to get a small stool and sat at the kitchen door, talking to Meg cutely. Because the little one always had new ideas for 3 meals. She might want to eat youtiao, soy milk, durian pizza at any time, so Meg prepared some small portions of semi-finished products in the fridge. For example, the dough needed to make youtiao could be kneaded into thin strips, and the youtiao could be directly fried in a pot of oil. Not long after, a double-flavored pot was placed on the table. Meg came out with 2 large trays of hot pot ingredients, which filled the whole table, including a large plate of golden youtiao. Amy reached out and picked up a section of youtiao, put it to her mouth and blew on it. Then she took a bite. The youtiao that had just come out of the pot was fragrant and crispy. The little one's lips curled up unconsciously, and she was overflowing with happiness. Meg helped Irina throw a plate of various kinds of mushrooms into the clear soup pot. This was her favorite way of eating. The thick bone broth turned into a mushroom broth, and the taste went up a level. Drinking the broth directly was an extremely delicious experience. It made the originally light soup pot rich, which was in line with her personal taste. Irina picked up a piece of beef roll and dipped it in the clear soup pot. She looked at Meg, who was adding red soup to his dipping sauce, and said, "Is this how your tavern is going to be? How is it?" Meg tasted his dipping sauce with his chopsticks and nodded with satisfaction. "There are no customers every day, so we have nothing to do." Amy swallowed the youtiao in her mouth and looked at Meg with a serious face. "We can't be lazy like this. So, how can we get more customers and make more money?" Meg knew that in the little one's heart, making more money must be a more important goal. He was very pleased that the little one had such a realistic understanding of making money at such a young age. At least, he didn't have to worry about her lack of money in the future. Of course, the little one sitting on 1 billion yuan would definitely not have to worry about money in this life. Of course, making money was just a hobby. However, this coincided with what Meg was going to do next. The tavern mission had been accepted, and it was now the third day of its opening. The Saipan Tavern was still in the small circle of the Ministry of War. Although the tavern had increased from 2,000 copper coins to more than 10,000, its popularity was still in the single digits. Oh, right, after that gentleman drank Moutai, the Saipan Tavern gained a little popularity, but it still didn't break through the single digits. What about today's turnover? Irina reached out her hand and looked at Meg with a smile. "Here it is." Meg's expression froze a little. He recalled his smug look at the door just now, but he still obediently took out all the turnover from his money bag and handed it to Irina. Irina took the money and put it beside her hand. Her smile got brighter as she looked at Meg and asked, "Do you have any plans?" To be able to make Mamie's the #1 restaurant in Chaos City, gain countless loyal customers, and have a full line every day, Meg's marketing methods were definitely not limited to this. As the saying goes, good wine fears no dark alleys. As a tavern, if you want good business, the key is whether the wine is good or not, Meg said. "Don't tell me you want Amy to sit at the door and drink?" Irina frowned slightly. Meg had used this trick many times at Mamie's. "How can that be? Children can't drink." Meg quickly waved his hand. Then, "The aroma of Moutai is irresistible to all wine lovers. So from tomorrow onwards, I will pour a glass of Moutai and put it at the door of the tavern. It will be locked in a metal cage to attract passing customers and the surrounding residents," Meg said with a smile. "Your idea?" Irina thought for a while and nodded in agreement. "Brilliant. But if there are more customers, you might have to work harder. Because the tavern will only be open for a month, I don't intend to recruit new employees for the time being," Meg said hesitantly. "It's all right. I can handle the money." Irina waved her hand calmly. "I can act cute to greet the customers." Amy blew on the tripe that Meg had just given her and pouted her little mouth cutely. "I can be in charge of serving the dishes," and said as she gestured with her hands. Chapter 2026. News of what happened in Rodu spread like wildfire across the Norland continent. As the heir to the Roth Empire's throne, Josh was actually controlled by the devil. He planned and promoted the war against the orcs and elves single-handedly, ordered the extermination of dozens of orc tribes, and cruelly annihilated the families of several officials in the Ministry of War, and killed Bloom. The entire Norland continent was in an uproar. All the races immediately questioned the Roth Empire with the dragons, demanding Andre to hand Josh over to investigate the matter and give the races an explanation. This matter also caused a huge commotion within the Roth Empire. The military, which was forced to take the blame in the beginning, mutinied after Bloom was killed, and there was confirmed news that he had called out Josh's name before he died. Several great generals, led by Marshal Dominic, requested Andre to investigate the matter and give an explanation to the officials in the Ministry of War and Bloom. Overnight, the Roth Empire had changed drastically. Andre sat alone in the royal study, looking at the memorial that Dominic had just submitted. Other than himself, There were also the signatures of the other 3 great generals of the empire. His expression was grave, and the veins on his forehead were throbbing. He was already on the verge of exploding. After a long silence, he finally spoke and said to the door, "Let them in." The door of the royal study was opened, and more than 10 top officials of the Roth Empire filed in. They stood on both sides with complicated expressions. If the Roth Empire could still control the war against the orcs and elves at the same time, then the second Prince Josh's collusion with the devil would shake the foundation of the Roth Empire. Andre's gaze swept across all the officials present, and he said in a deep voice, "Josh was disturbed by the devil and committed such a heinous crime. From today onwards, he will be stripped of his position as the prince. All departments will pursue him to bring him to justice, and give an explanation to the innocent citizens and officials who died tragically." Many officials heaved a sigh of relief upon hearing that. "Your Majesty is wise." All the officials bowed. Andre's declaration meant that Josh had been completely abandoned, and the fight for the throne that had lasted for many years was finally over. Sean would become the future king of the Roth Empire. The officials on Sean's side all had joy and excitement in their eyes. They were originally evenly matched, but Sean won easily because of Josh's foolish actions. Meanwhile, the officials on Josh's side didn't look too good. This incident had shaken the entire Norland continent. Even His Majesty had no choice but to declare his stance, so they naturally didn't dare to be unlucky at such a time. In fact, most people were thinking of how to cut ties with Josh. At a time like this, any relationship with the devil was something that ordinary people couldn't afford. Andre paused for a moment before continuing, "I will announce this to the world and make Sean the crown prince. The Roth Empire will be at odds with the devils, and we will fight against the devils together with all the races. We will kill everything related to the devils." This news quickly spread from the Roth Empire's royal palace to the entire Norland continent. It was delivered to everyone who was paying attention to this matter. As expected of the old fox, he's faster and more decisive than I am. His of is expected is to's expected of's to be expected of this is was expected. As expected, he has already lost the space to choose, and taking a step back will lead him into the abyss. Compared to a son who has lost control, it's not difficult to make this decision. Irina only took a glance before lowering her head and continuing to drink her soy milk. "That's true," Meg nodded. However, he was still rather satisfied with this outcome. At least, the show they put on that night was very successful and perfectly met his expectations. The world was so big that there was no longer a place for Joshua to stay. To someone who aspired to become the king of the Roth Empire, and who loved to show off, this was worse than death. After breakfast, Meg brought Irina and the 2 children shopping as usual. He didn't have to manage the restaurant, and was just so relaxed and comfortable. Of course, whenever he thought of those customers squatting outside the restaurant and waiting for him to return to Chaos City, he would still feel uneasy occasionally. Amy, who was wearing a little rabbit hat, looked up at Meg and asked expectantly, "Father, where are we going to play today?" Meg looked at Amy and said, "Let's go to the bookstore in the west of the city today. I heard that it's the largest bookstore on the Norland continent. There are countless bookstores of different sizes, and you can find any book you want if you put in the effort." Amy's eyes lit up, and she said, "Sure. Then I can buy some pretty picture books. I saw some interesting picture books yesterday." Anne's eyes also lit up at the mention of picture books, and she looked at Meg with anticipation in her eyes. The books there are only at the level of children's reading. Irina didn't agree with Meg's assessment, but she didn't object to Meg's suggestion, either. Meg hailed a horse-drawn carriage, and informed the coachman before heading straight to the bookstore in the west of the city. The bookstore in the west of the city was actually a market made up of many bookstores. It could be said that most of the bookstores in Rodu were gathered here, and all of the magazine publishers had also set up their headquarters here. There were bookstores of all sizes. There were large bookstores that were thousands of square meters in size, and small bookstores that had all kinds of ancient books stacked into small mountains within a few square meters. After passing through one alleyway after another, and turning around one corner after another, one might just be able to find the textbook that one had been searching so hard for in an extremely inconspicuous corner. The horse-drawn carriage stopped in front of the largest bookstore in the bookstore, and Meg paid the coachman before expressing his gratitude to him, and everyone alighted from the carriage. "Wow! Isn't that father?" Amy jumped down from the horse-drawn carriage and exclaimed at the sight of a portrait of a chef standing in front of the bookstore. Irina and N were also quite surprised. It was a magazine cover that was over 2 meters tall, and it was from Whole Foods and Meats. It was a promotional poster for the new magazine. Aside from the words Whole Foods and Meats on the cover, there was also an uncolored sketch of a chef. Regardless of whether it was his clothes or his appearance, he was indeed quite similar to Meg. Of course, the most important thing was that there was a line of text next to the portrait. Norland Continent's #1 chef. Meg. How embarrassing. Meg shook his head. Hee, you should have heard about this already, right? Irina looked at Meg with a hint of a smile on her face, as if she had already seen through his little trick. I heard that the magazine was going to be released today, but I didn't think that it would be released in such a way. Meg splayed his hands open. If he had known about this, he wouldn't have minded sending a handsome full-body photo to the editorial department. Only then would he be able to attract more female fans. Chapter 2027. Whole Food Mart must have spent a lot of money on the new issue of the magazine. At the entrance of every bookstore, there were signs with their own drawings. In addition, there was the headline of this issue. Shocking! The father of fried eggplants with fish's first interview did such a thing to the editor. So, did you do something shameful with that editor behind my back? Irina scrutinized Meg. That editor is a man. Meg looked innocent. This headline was really harmful. Why did the shocking news start to spread in this world? A man? Irina's expression was a little strange. It's not what you think. Meg quickly said, "What do you think I think?" Irina didn't comment. "Forget it, I'll go buy a copy to prove my innocence." Meg helplessly walked to the bookstore. He actually wanted to see how this issue of Whole Food Mart was doing and whether it could achieve the publicity effect he expected. Meg and the others didn't leave early. Most of the bookstores in the bookstore were already open. At this time, there were already many customers in this medium-sized bookstore. Meg purposely chose a bookstore that was rather crowded because he wanted to see if Whole Food Mart's reputation was really as strong as those two fellows had boasted. "Boss, I want a copy of Whole Food Mart." "I want 3 copies of Whole Food Mart." "I want 2 copies here too." As soon as Meg entered the bookstore, he saw a group of people crowding around the counter of the bookstore, shouting as if they were ordering food. So popular? Could it be an act? Meg raised his eyebrows and looked suspiciously at the group of people around the counter. Mainly young girls. "Little girl, why do you all want to buy this book?" Meg moved forward and asked a girl standing at the edge, "Uncle, you don't know this, right? This is the first time our Prince Charming has accepted an official interview with a magazine. And it is said that there is a portrait of him in the magazine." The girl looked at him and said excitedly, "Prince Charming?" Meg frowned. "Isn't this a gourmet magazine? Why is there such a thing as a Prince Charming?" "Of course it's a gourmet magazine. Our Prince Charming is a super amazing chef. He once won the title of the best chef at His Majesty's birthday, but he refused to stay in the imperial kitchen. The eggplant with garlic sauce that he created made vegetarianism break the record for a single issue since its inception. What he created." The girl spoke with great familiarity. The more Meg listened, the stranger his expression became. Why did this plot sound so familiar? "Forget it. You won't understand even if I tell you. You don't know how to cook." The girl retracted her gaze with some disdain and said with some elegance, "This is the Prince Charming of us foodies. A man who was born to change the world of foodies." "Understood, understood." Meg nodded. It was good to be a fan. However, Meg was a little puzzled as he looked at the girls who were buying the magazine enthusiastically. Since his fan base had appeared, why didn't his faith value show any obvious changes? The more than 30,000 fans he had now were all from Chaos City. The god of cookery's faith value is based on the other party's desire to learn from your culinary skills and put it into action. The system's explanation sounded in Meg's mind. So, these people are only after my body? Meg took half a step back and became a little more vigilant. Meg still managed to buy 4 magazines in the end, which could be considered as a wave of support for himself. According to the system, it was not enough to just have fans for looks and talent. He had to convert them into real fans who would take the initiative to try cooking. This was a heavy responsibility and a long way to go. Everyone would collect a bunch of fitness, cooking, and travel tutorials in their favorites, but they would never open it a second time. Yes, it was talking about him. It was self-evident that it was difficult to rely on a magazine to get many people to follow his cooking. Of course, if the magazine circulation was high enough and the reader base was big enough, even if the click rate was low, he could still gain some effective followers. Here, Meg handed one of the magazines to Irina, and the other 2 to Amy and Anne. He took one for himself. He had read the draft before, and did not feel that there was anything shameful. However, he was a little surprised that Whole Foods and Delicacies used almost the entire cover to promote him. Wow, so handsome. That mustache is so sexy. He's indeed my Prince Charming. Even Her Highness Princess Vanessa is head over heels for him. Worth it, worth it. I'm gonna buy 10 more. However, before Meg could flip open the magazine, the girls beside him were already panicking. If I say there's nothing between Vanessa and me, you should believe me, right? Meg said to Irina. Irina lowered her head and flipped through the magazine in her hand. Without even looking up, she said, "You and her don't have the guts." Meg's heart warmed instantly. This was trust. He opened the cover and skipped the table of contents. The first page was an interview about him. This interview, written by Milo, was not bad. Of course, this kind of writing was not very impressive to Meg. In addition to some of the issues discussed that day, there were also a few mushy praises at the end. Something like handsome, a gentleman. It was too realistic. TSK. This author? Don't tell me he has any thoughts about you? Irina looked up at Meg with a look of disgust. I'll stay away from him next time. Meg nodded. At the end of the article, there was a note. There is a tutorial on eggplant with garlic sauce written by Mr. Meg himself, and a portrait of Mr. Meg. Meg glanced at the table of contents and flipped to the second article in the middle. He skipped over the recipe that he had written, and indeed he saw that very animated portrait. Do you think this is you? Irina glanced at the portrait and asked. Meg pondered for a long time and said, it's a 2D person. It has to satisfy the reader's imagination as much as possible. It doesn't matter if it looks like me or not. Yes, this portrait had nothing to do with him at all. However, it was drawn quite handsomely. As a virtual idol, he could give the artist an extra chicken leg. At least from the reaction of those young girls, it was completely to their liking. Why do you suddenly want to be famous? Irina put away the magazine and looked at Meg with some confusion. Life is always about trying something new. Speak human language. The simple. I just want to see how famous I can be by cooking, Meg said with a serious face. Irina stared at Meg for a while and nodded. Very good. Chapter 2028. The bookstore in the western part of the city was a paradise for book lovers. As long as you were diligent enough, you could always find the book you wanted. The group of people found a bookstore with no customers, but there were many picture albums on display. The 2 children were looking for their favorite picture album in the pile of books, while Meg chatted with the bookstore owner. Boss, why don't you sell Whole Food magazine in your store? The other stores are selling very well. Meg glanced at the store and said. The boss looked at the customers who were buying magazines in front of the other bookstores and curled his lips in disdain. Heh! What's so good about a gourmet magazine? It won't make much money. If you can get the exclusive rights to sell a few best-selling books, that's called making money. Oh, there are best-selling books? Meg was a little surprised. Although he had collected many ancient books, he didn't know much about the book market in this world. The boss pointed at the bookstore next door that had not opened yet and said, That's right. Do you see that bookstore next door? They only sell 3 books, 1 book every 10 days. They can sell 300,000 copies a month. Just based on this, the boss got married to his 8th wife last month. Meg was surprised and said, "You can marry 8 wives here? Your focus seems to be a little different." The boss looked at him strangely. Irina looked over and looked at him with a smile that wasn't a smile. She said, "What, you also plan to marry 8 or 10 wives?" Meg's face changed slightly. He realized that he had lost his composure and quickly said, "No, no, no. How could I have such an extravagant and lascivious thought? 8 wives added together can't be as beautiful as you." The boss looked at Irina and said with some envy, "Of course." Meg straightened his back a lot. Irina's lips curled up slightly. She withdrew her gaze and picked up a picture album to flip through. "Oh yes, boss, what are the best-selling books in this bookstore?" Meg asked the boss. "If we're talking about the best-selling books, of course it would be the best-selling books for knights. Alex's doujinshi books were selling like crazy back then. Men, women, adults, and children were all crazy about Alex's books. Every book sold like hotcakes. Those years of popularity are still unsurpassed today. The colorful storybooks and picture albums with Alex as the main character are even more in short supply." The boss sighed with emotion, and there was a hint of nostalgia in his expression. There's such a thing?" Meg raised his eyebrows. "Don't tell me you don't even know who Alex is?" The boss looked at him with disdain, and continued, "Back then, he and Princess Irina made a name for themselves on the Norland continent, and left behind countless stories and legends. They became important material for countless authors, and supported a large number of authors. I just moved from the countryside to the city." Meg nodded. He looked around. "But you don't have any picture albums related to him in your shop now?" The boss was enlightened. The country bumpkin's words were understandable. He explained, "Recently, Alex has reappeared, and staged an even more shocking return of the king. He even saved the world single-handedly. He has stirred up waves in the hearts of the Roth Empire's citizens, and his popularity is very high. However, he has rebelled against the Roth Empire. His words and actions are disrespectful to the king. No one would dare to write about him even if they had the guts. Not to mention us bookstore owners. Who isn't afraid of losing their heads?" "I see." Meg was deep in thought. He was thinking if he could try to attract attention since his sock puppet was so popular. The boss picked up a picture book from the bookshelf at the door. With a smile, he said, "Knight picture books are still our shop's main attraction. Children love to see stories of knights defeating demon kings. Girls love to see stories of knights defeating demon kings and heroes saving the damsel in distress. Men love to see stories of knights defeating demon kings and heroes saving the damsel in distress." Meg glanced at the picture book that the boss gave him. The dragon warrior battling Medusa in the demon's cave. Meg frowned slightly. Then, he put down the magazine without a change in expression. "Seems like it was a rather tragic battle." The boss let out a series of vulgar laughter that all men understood. Meg pretended not to understand, and said, "Boss, are the authors popular here? Do they have many fans?" "That depends on the person," the boss said slowly. "Usually, ugly authors don't show their faces. They try their best to create a sense of mystery and give the reader space to imagine. As for handsome authors like you, most of them will find a good artist to draw their portrait in the book. From there, they will attract some fans who are not talented. Of course, there are also some shameless authors who will use women's clothing to sell their looks to retain fans. Of course, this method won't last long. Fans nowadays are all big pig trotters." "There are such tricks." Meg was shocked. He didn't expect there to be so many twists and turns. "That's right. Didn't you see the cover of Whole Foods magazine just now? It's really shameless. A gourmet magazine doesn't focus on gourmet food, but actually uses a chef's image as a selling point. Could it be that being handsome can make the dishes better? And maybe that chef looks like a ghost in person," the boss said with a look of disdain. Meg frowned slightly. He felt like he was scolding 2 people in 2 sentences. The boss sized up Meg and asked, "Why? You're asking so many questions. Do you want to write too?" I'm just asking casually. It's good that you didn't take it seriously. Writing and drawing comics is a dead end. Chapter 2029. Reading one's own book must be a very shameful experience. That's it? Meg had only skimmed through that book of dragon-slaying warriors fighting huge evil dragons, and it was already relegated to the corner of history. Be it the story or the style, they were all inferior. It was hard to imagine that a book of this standard could be hidden away and sold by the shop owner like a treasure. Of course, this could also be determined by the rarity of the subject matter. After lunch, everyone went back to the restaurant. The two little fellows were reading the new sketchbook that they had just bought with relish. Irina had something to do, so Mag was left alone to read the few ancient books that he had gotten today out of boredom. With the book in his hand, Meg's mind was not on it. Instead, he was thinking about Josh's next move. It had been a few days since the battle between the Roth Empire, the Orcs, and the Elves. The originally tense situation had become even more complicated because of Josh's incident. The Orcs, who had dozens of their tribes wiped out, were obviously not going to let the matter rest just because Josh was controlled by the devil. The Elves, who had almost lost their city of life, were also going to demand an explanation. Andrei did not give any direct response to this. The number of soldiers sent to the border was even increasing, and the situation was still tense. Now that Josh was wanted by the entire continent, it could be said that he was the enemy of the entire world. With so many eyes on him, it would be difficult for him to do anything big. However, it was still troublesome that they could not find any trace of him. "Father, look. This is Big Sister Anne's painting." Amy's voice interrupted Meg's thoughts. He looked down at the painting in front of him, and his eyes lit up. It was a drawing of a silver-haired fairy. It was drawn with a watercolor pen, and it was AI-me. The painting style was young, but it was precisely because of this that it looked cute and childlike. Moreover, every stroke was very smooth, and there was no stiffness at all. It made the character look lively and cute. "Wow, this is great." Meg looked at Anne with surprise. "Is this Anne's first time drawing?" Anne smiled and nodded. "Yes, I only know how to draw circles that aren't too round. But Big Sister Anne already knows how to draw me," Amy said proudly, as if she had contributed to this. "What an extraordinary talent in painting." Meg rubbed his chin. Looking at Anne, his eyes lit up. "And, are you interested in becoming a cartoonist?" Anne tilted her head and looked at Meg. She didn't seem to understand what Meg said. Meg explained, "Manga artists are professional artists who draw comic books. These comic books were created by manga artists." Anne's eyes lit up. She nodded and said with sign language, "I'm willing." Meg smiled and said, "That's good. You can continue to draw according to your preferences. If you're really interested, I'll give you a script later. You can draw a story according to the script." Anne nodded obediently. She sat down and flipped through the comic book. Then, she picked up the watercolor pen beside her and continued to draw. In this case, the Little Master of China project. "Can I start it?" Meg rubbed his chin and fell into deep thought. "Father, remember to attract customers today?" Amy whispered when she saw Meg in a daze. "If Amy didn't mention it, I would have forgotten." Meg smiled and rubbed the little girl's head. He got up and walked to the wine cabinet. From the bottom of the wine cabinet, he took out a small bottle of Moutai wine that Irina drank the day before yesterday. He opened the bottle cap and poured a small cup into a small jar that looked like a small incense burner. The small semi-sealed jar had a few fine holes on it. It was just enough to let the fragrance of the wine out, but it wouldn't disappear all of a sudden. Fishing for drunkards was the same principle as fishing. First, build a nest and use the fragrance of the wine to attract drunkards to gather. Once people gathered, there would be no lack of customers. This method was somewhat different from opening a restaurant. After all, as long as the restaurant wasn't a roadside stall, it wouldn't be easy to attract customers from far and near with the fragrance. Mag went out with the specially made wine goblet and a small iron cage in his hand. He placed the goblet in the cage and put a small lock on it before hanging it on the pillar at the door. The rich fragrance of the Mautai wine slowly drifted out. Although it spread very slowly and the fragrance was diluted a lot, it still continued to spread out with the stable and unique fragrance. The faint fragrance of the wine was centered around the Saipan Tavern and slowly spread to the surroundings. It smells so good. Is this the fragrance of wine? Yeah, it smells like wine, but there's no wine with such a rich fragrance. When the customers passed by, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. They were surprised at where the fragrance of the wine came from. Some of the wine lovers followed the fragrance of the wine and found the small iron cage hanging in front of the Saipan Tavern. What is this operation? Why did they lock up the wine? This is a new tavern, right? I've never heard of it before. Could it be that they want to use the fragrance of the wine to attract customers? People are attracted, but the tavern isn't open yet. It only opens at 6 p.m. Many passers-by followed the fragrance of the wine and gathered at the entrance of the tavern. They looked at the small wine cup in the iron cage and swallowed their saliva. But when they saw the wooden sign hanging on the door that said the opening hours, they felt helpless. Lady boss, look, there are many customers gathered at the entrance of the tavern across the street. In the Titan Tavern, the waiter looked at Ai Fei, who just came down from her afternoon nap, and said, "Their family finally opened for business?" Ai Fei stretched her back and smiled lazily. Her lithe figure was accentuated by her loose cotton clothes. According to her observations over the past few days, this Saipan Tavern was like a child's play. The opening hours were extremely short, and there were very few customers. It was clear that they were only doing business because of their interest. No, it seems that the owner put a jug of wine at the entrance, and it attracted the customers. The waiter shook his head. A jug of wine? Ai Fei was a little surprised. She quickly walked to the entrance of the tavern and looked at the dozen or so people gathered in front of the Saipan Tavern diagonally across the street. They were indeed surrounding a small iron cage hanging on a pillar at the entrance of the tavern. Her nose twitched, and her brows furrowed slightly. Even though they were quite far away, there was still a faint fragrance of wine in the air. As a woman who had inherited the family business and managed the Titan Tavern for more than 10 years, even though she couldn't personally brew any fine wine, she was still quite knowledgeable about wine. She had never heard of a wine that could emit such a fragrant aroma from such a distance. Ai Fei murmured, "With such fine wine in hand, this Saipan Tavern will definitely have a place in the tavern world of Romo Street. Let alone Romo Street." "Boss, what did you say?" The waiter didn't hear her clearly. "Nothing. Just be more respectful when you see the owner of the tavern across the street in the future." Ai Fei withdrew her gaze and gave the waiter some instructions before turning to enter the tavern. "Even if I can't get him, I have to get his wine." Chapter 2030. The plan to attract customers with the aroma of wine was a success. Before the tavern opened for business, there were more than a dozen customers waiting at the entrance of the Saipan Tavern. Of course, they were only interested customers. The price of a bottle of wine was 2,000 copper coins, so some customers would be filtered out. Those who stayed were the real customers. Irina was not back yet, so and went upstairs to draw. Meg looked at Amy and said with a smile, "Amy, today we will be the ones to receive the customers." "Okay." Amy nodded obediently and clenched her little fist. "I will treat them gently." Meg smiled and opened the door of the tavern. Looking at the dozen or so customers waiting outside, he said, "Sorry for the wait. Welcome." "Boss, your opening time is really on point. We have been waiting here for so long, but you didn't even let us go in first." A customer complained. If it wasn't for the aroma of the wine being so tempting, he would have never been treated like this. The other customers also complained a few times. The tavern opens on time every day. Customers only need to wait for the sun to set. Meg said calmly. The opening time would not be changed. This was the tavern's rule. Although everyone was a little unhappy with Meg's stiff reply, since the tavern was already open, they didn't have to wait at the door anymore. They all went in one after another to try the intoxicating wine. Mautai wine, 2,000 copper coins a bottle. Whiskey, 2,000 copper coins a bottle. People quickly saw the prices of the 2 wines and several side dishes in the conspicuous places behind the wine cabinet. "So expensive," someone exclaimed. There were not many taverns on Romo Street, and the prices were generally cheap. Generally, it was only a few dozen copper coins to a little more than 100 copper coins a bottle. But the 2 wines in this tavern were actually as expensive as 2,000 copper coins a bottle. "Boss, do you sell your wine by the jar?" a customer asked. "It's on the wine cabinet." Meg pointed at the wine cabinet inside, which was filled with 2 kinds of wine. "It's a little expensive for such a small bottle. I have a friend coming over. I'll go pick him up first." "What a coincidence, I have a friend too." In the blink of an eye, there were only 3 or 4 customers left in the tavern. A man in an official's robe looked at Meg and asked, "Boss, what kind of wine are you hanging at the door?" "This Moutai." Meg pointed at the round Moutai bottle on the wine cabinet. "I want a bottle of this Moutai wine and a set of dishes," the man said, and sat down with the other men. Since someone had placed an order, only those who could afford 2,000 copper coins a bottle of wine remained. They also ordered Moutai and sat down. 2,000 copper coins for a bottle of wine was considered expensive on Romo Street, but in the famous taverns and pubs in the north of the city, such a price was not eye-catching. The aroma of the wine was what attracted these customers to take a seat and order a bottle to try. On Romo Street, a black carriage was moving slowly. Abraham sat in the carriage with a grave expression on his face. He had just come out from the Ministry of War. Because of Josh's matter, this was the first time he had stepped into the Ministry of War. However, things were as bad as he had heard. Josh was no longer the Josh he knew, and he could not stand up for Andre's decision. Demons, what a terrifying existence. He did not know how Josh had provoked demons, and perhaps no one would know either. There was nothing he could do about it at the moment, and he did not even know how to explain it to Vanessa. All he wanted now was to find a place to drink some wine and be alone. Just then, a whiff of wine aroma wafted in from outside the carriage. "What is this smell?" Abraham's nose twitched, and he lifted a corner of the curtain in surprise. The aroma of wine wafted in his face, and the words Saipan Tavern came into his sight. "Stop the carriage," Abraham said. The carriage drove forward for a while before stopping. Abraham said, "Turn around and go to the tavern at the back." The carriage turned around and stopped in front of Saipan Tavern. Abraham alighted from the carriage and looked at the rather new tavern. His eyes were quickly attracted by the small iron cage hanging on the pillar at the entrance. There was a glass of wine inside, and the alluring aroma came from that small glass. "Isn't this aroma a little too strong and alluring?" Abraham went up to take a sniff, then pushed the door open and walked into the tavern. Since he wanted to drink, he would drink something good. If he was going to get drunk, he might as well lose to good wine. There were not many people in the tavern, but as soon as Abraham entered, he almost fainted from the strong aroma of the wine. It was the same wine that he had smelled at the entrance, but the wine in the tavern was even stronger and more alluring. The customers who had ordered the wine were all sipping and tasting it. From their expressions, he could tell that the wine was indeed good, and it was not just the aroma. Amy looked at Abraham, and her eyes lit up. She opened her mouth to call for someone. "What would you like to drink?" Meg just came out of the kitchen with a plate of cold pig's ears. His eyes lit up when he saw Abraham, and he asked calmly. Amy looked at Meg, and as if she suddenly thought of something, she obediently shut her mouth and did not say anything. Abraham glanced at the pig's ear salad on the tray in Meg's hand. He was a little shocked that this red salad looked very similar to the husband and wife lung slice. Even the spiciness was similar. He glanced at the wine list on the wall and said, "Give me a bottle of wine that's the same as theirs, and a set of side dishes for the wine." "Okay." Meg nodded and went to serve the dishes. Abraham retracted his gaze and was about to find a place to sit down when he saw the quiet little girl sitting behind the wine cabinet. The little girl looked to be only 4 or 5 years old. She had a delicate appearance, long black hair, and a pair of bright black eyes. She sat quietly and was obedient and cute. I didn't expect the boss to have such an obedient and cute daughter. Abraham couldn't help but think of Mamie's. He wondered where little boss and Mr. Mac were now. He really missed Mamie's food. "Hello, little girl." Abraham smiled and greeted her. "Hello, Grandpa Fatty." Amy greeted him obediently. "How dare you?" The guard's face turned cold. This little girl actually dared to address the Duke in such a manner. "He yelled at me," Amy immediately said with an aggrieved expression. Her big eyes were glistening with tears. "What does this have to do with you? Get out." Abraham turned around and kicked the guards, but chasing him out. He then looked at Amy with a smile and coaxed, "Good girl. Don't be afraid. Grandpa Fatty just kicked him out." Okay. Amy's face immediately showed an angelic smile. Abraham heaved a sigh of relief and looked around. Fortunately, this was not Mamie's. Otherwise, little boss would not have said that she was afraid. She would have greeted him with a fireball. Chapter 2031. The tavern style and atmosphere made Abraham feel very comfortable. There weren't many people sitting around. Perhaps it was because the wine was too delicious, or perhaps it was because these people couldn't hold their liquor, but there were already a few drunken customers in the tavern. It wasn't as noisy as normal taverns. Abraham chose a corner seat and sat alone with his face facing the wall. He didn't have to worry about being recognized or disturbed. He just wanted to drink some wine alone and not think about anything else. If he got drunk, he would go back to sleep and think about other things when he woke up the next day. Not long after, Meg placed 3 dishes and a bottle of Moutai in front of Abraham. "Thanks." Abraham thanked him casually, but his eyes were already attracted by the 3 dishes in front of him. The peanuts were skinned and stir-fried, and they were wrapped in chili and white sugar. All kinds of spices had already seeped into the peanuts, and they were crispy and fragrant. "They look pretty good. Let's try these drunkards' peanuts first." Abraham picked up a peanut and threw it into his mouth. Crunch! The peanut's crispy texture exploded in his mouth with just a light bite. The spiciness and fragrance of the spices that had already permeated the peanuts also blossomed. It was a small peanut, but it contained so many flavors and variations. The more he chewed, the more fragrant it became. It was truly astonishing. Incredible. A small peanut can be fried to such a delectable level, and it really does go well with wine. The spicy taste blossomed on his lips, and Abraham unconsciously opened the wine beside him as he marveled at the wonderful taste of the drunkard's peanuts. The clear wine was poured into a crystal glass, and the rich aroma of the wine wafted into his nostrils as he picked up the glass. Even Abraham, who wasn't a big fan of wine, couldn't help but want to praise, "Good wine." Abraham knew a thing or two about wine tasting. He didn't pick up the glass and drink it in one gulp. Instead, he took a deep breath of the wine's aroma and let it swirl in his mind before he took a small sip. The warm and delicate wine moistened his lips before sliding into his mouth. It was rich and fragrant, and the taste was refreshing. It complemented the drunkard's peanuts very well, and after swallowing, the fragrance lingered in his mouth and teeth. Who would have thought that there would be such a long wait in this world? Even the fine wines offered by the various lands paled in comparison to this. Abraham was astonished. He had tasted many of the fine wines offered to the king over the years, but none of them had given him as much of a shock as this Moutai. He couldn't help but take another sip. This time, he closed his eyes and savored the various flavors of the wine. It didn't have the sweetness of fruit wine, nor did it have the bitterness of grain wine that was hard to swallow. He didn't know what the winemaker had used or what he had added to make the wine so enchanting that it made people want to be intoxicated. Then he couldn't help but think of the past. Back in the day, the struggle for the throne had been a bloody one. Now, Josh and Sean had embarked on the same path, and Josh had gone astray because of it, stepping into a never-ending abyss, and sigh. Abraham sighed and sniffed to control his emotions. He put down the wine glass, and his gaze landed on the cold mixed pig's ears and cold mixed pig's tongue at the side. To be honest, the first time he saw these 2 dishes, he thought of Mamie's. He thought of the cold mixed dish with the same red color, husband and wife lung slice, the familiar spicy taste, and the ingredients that normal people wouldn't dare to serve. Pig's ears and pig's tongue. He wouldn't have doubted if these were Mr. Mac's new dishes that had just come out. But in a newly opened tavern like Rodu, these two strange dishes actually appeared. It really surprised him. Could it be that the owner went to Mamie's to get scriptures? Abraham looked back at the wine cabinet suspiciously. The owner of the tavern was sitting behind the counter, reading a book calmly. With Mr. Mac's busy life, it's impossible for him to be so carefree in this lifetime. Abraham retracted his gaze and picked up a piece of pig's tongue with his chopsticks. After Abraham's view of food was remolded by Mamie's, he was extremely tolerant of these strange foods. After all, he could chew roasted pig's eyes until his mouth was full. Pig's tongue and pig's ears were simply watery. He picked up a piece of pig's tongue that was wrapped in chili oil. Felt like lean meat through the chopsticks. After cutting it into thin slices, it didn't look disgusting at all. It was just like sliced beef. It was wrapped in chili oil and decorated with some cooked sesame seeds. Instead, it felt rather tempting. Abraham couldn't help but put the pig's tongue into his mouth, and then took a bite. The spicy chili oil exploded in his mouth first, and the rich aroma and spiciness blossomed on the tip of his tongue. Then the taste of the pig's tongue blossomed. The fragrance of the braised meat, coupled with the unique texture of the pig's tongue, was more springy than beef. It was juicier when chewed, and the fragrance of the braised meat had completely permeated the tongue. It was spicy and fresh, and the taste buds welcomed a long-lost thrill and frenzy. Rip! Abraham felt a button on his clothes suddenly burst open for a long time, and his innermost thermal clothes directly burst open. This, damn it, did he steal Mr. Mac's chili sauce bun? How can it be so delicious? Abraham was dumbfounded. He looked at the plate of cold pig's tongue in front of him with a face of disbelief. Compared to wine tasting, food was his true field of expertise. In this lonely little street, in a newly opened little pub, he actually ate food that was comparable to Mamie's. Oh my God! If the owner didn't go and learn from Mr. Mac, then he must be a genius. Abraham took a small sip of wine, suppressed the shock in his heart, and looked at the cold pig's ear at the side. The pig's ear was also wrapped in chili oil. It was a bright red color, sprinkled with cooked sesame seeds, and looked very appetizing. Without hesitation, he picked up a pig's ear and put it into his mouth. The spicy taste was still the same, but the unique crispy bone of the pig's ear gave him an extremely wonderful chewy texture. The soft pig's ear meat sandwiched the thin crispy bone, and when chewing, he could hear the crisp sound of chewing. This is too good. Abraham raised his eyebrows, and he felt his entire mental state relax a lot. Indeed, food was the most healing. However, good wine was a perfect match. A small sip of wine, a mouthful of food, and drinking alone, but it was still delicious. At this time, a group of middle-aged men in official uniforms walked into the pub, found a table for 8 and sat down. They ordered a few bottles of wine and a few dishes to go with the wine. A middle-aged official with a potbelly pointed at Amy, who was sitting behind the counter, and said, "That little brat, come and pour wine for the masters." Chapter 2032. During this period of time, the Roth Empire was in turmoil. Apart from the Ministry of War, which was at the center of the storm, the Ministry of Law, which specialized in prisons, was also very busy. All of the prisons in Rodu were packed to the brim. In order to catch the culprit behind the murder of the Minister of War's entire family, almost all of the criminals in Rodu had been thoroughly searched, and many old cases had been resolved. After the king announced Josh as the culprit yesterday, the burden on the Ministry of Law's shoulders was finally lifted. Today, the officials of the Ministry of Justice had decided to come out for a drink. They had heard from the people from the Ministry of War that a new tavern had opened on Romo Street and that the wine inside was a rare brew. The group had come with the intention of taking a look. As soon as they entered, the aroma of the wine was indeed alluring. However, when they saw the shabby decor, many people frowned, but they still sat down for the sake of the wine. Alden was the third in command of the Ministry of Law, and he was the one who organized this gathering. Most of the people who came were also his trusted subordinates. After holding back his anger for a few days, he came to drink and relax. In his opinion, this tavern was a little terrible. The price of the wine was not low, but there were only 2 or 3 shabby dishes. Even things like peanuts, pig's ears, and pig's tongue were served on the table. However, it was Sir Joseph who decided to come to this tavern. As the second in command of the Ministry of Law, Joseph had joined them at the last minute, so Alden naturally couldn't reject him. However, the service in this tavern was really terrible. There wasn't even a waiter to pour the wine. One had to know that in other taverns, when they saw the group of people enter, the shopkeeper would personally wait at the side to pour wine for them. Hence, his gaze landed on the little girl sitting behind the counter. Although this little girl was a little young, she was quite adorable. Letting her pour the wine would make the mood better. Hence, Alden ordered Amy arrogantly, "That little brat, come and pour wine for us." Alden's voice wasn't soft, and many people in the tavern turned to look. Many people had noticed the boss's adorable little girl just now. She was only 3 or 4 years old, but someone actually made such an unreasonable request of her to pour wine. However, when they turned back and saw Alden and his group, they all retracted their gazes. The Ministry of Justice was also feared by many officials in the officialdom. After all, being targeted by them was never a good thing. Joseph frowned when he heard this. He glanced at Amy, who was sitting behind the counter, and said, "Forget it. She's so young. How can she carry a bottle of wine?" "Your Excellency, there's no need for pity. It's just a bottle of wine." Since they can't afford a waiter, they should at least find someone to pour wine for us. Alden smiled and waved his hand. He looked at Amy, who was sitting behind the counter, and said coldly, "Little brat, can't you hear me? Brat, are you talking about me?" Amy rested her chin on her hands and looked at Alden with confusion. "Is there anyone younger than you here?" Alden glared. "Here." Amy picked up Ugly Duckling from a nearby chair. "So you're calling it Howl?" Ugly Duckling, who had been dressed up as a red panda, yawned, and continued to sleep on the counter. When the crowd saw this scene, they all let out smiles. "Why, you're messing with me." Alden's face darkened. No one dared to mess with him in front of so many people. Amy shook her head with a serious expression. She waved her hand and said, "You don't look easy to mess with." Alden slammed the table and stood up. "Bastard! Do you know who I am?" "Your Excellency, since you're an official, it's not very appropriate for you to make such a request to a child." Meg walked out of the kitchen with a cleaver in his hand. He stood beside Amy and looked at Alden. Fortunately, Irina wasn't in the tavern at the moment. Otherwise, the folding chair would have sent this fatty, who had quite a bit of authority, to the ground. The customers in the shop looked at Alden with disdain. How could a burly official be so rude and unreasonable to an eccentric little girl? How despicable! Alden was so angry that he laughed. He looked at Meg and said, "You unruly commoner. We're officials of the Ministry of Law. It's her fortune to be served by wine. Aren't you afraid that I'll shut down your little tavern and throw the 2 of you in jail?" "That's right. Do you really think you're something when you run a small tavern? Hurry up and apologize to His Excellency Alden. Otherwise, he'll shut down your tavern. It'll only take a word from him." A few officials at the same table chimed in. They hadn't seen such an arrogant person in a long time. When the customers heard that, their expressions changed slightly. They all looked away to prevent themselves from being implicated. Joseph was a little displeased when he heard that. However, after a moment of hesitation, he still didn't say anything. Meg pursed his lips. He waved the cleaver in his hand, wondering if he should still keep the tavern. "Shut down! Shut down! Shut down your mother!" Right at this moment, a cursing voice sounded from the corner. A fat figure rushed out from the corner. With a smack, he threw a half-eaten plate of cold pig ears at Alden's face. Smack! The plate fell to the ground with a crisp sound. The tavern fell silent instantly. Everyone was shocked as they looked at Alden, whose face was covered in red oil and pig ears, with a dumbfounded expression. This was an official of the Ministry of Law. He was of high status and had a high status. Sir. The officials at the same table were also stunned. Chapter 2033. Alden was dumbfounded. All he did was show off his authority in a small tavern. He never thought that he would provoke the smiling tiger Abraham. His face was already swollen and painful. There were even a few pig ears on his face. The red oil flowed down his neck and dripped onto his official robe, but he didn't dare to wipe it off. Abraham was famous for his good temper, but anyone who was old or had reached a certain position knew that he was the one who killed his 2 elder brothers to help His Majesty ascend to the throne. He was a ruthless man. I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dare. Alden quickly shook his head, sweat dripping from his forehead. As an experienced official, he still had the basic ability to read people's expressions. He could tell that Abraham was not in a good mood. Joseph also quickly said, "Duke, you must be joking. How could we let you pour wine for us? We didn't notice you were in the tavern. Otherwise, we would have all come to propose a toast to you." The officials from the Ministry of Justice all agreed. They were all panicking and no longer had their previous arrogance. "So it's Duke Abraham. I didn't expect him to be drinking here." "That's right. These lords have kicked an iron plate. If that's the case, then this tavern must have quite the backing. Even Lord Abraham is backing them." The customers in the tavern were shocked by Abraham's identity. At the same time, they looked at Alden and the others as if they were watching a good show. The more arrogant they were before, the more embarrassed they were now. This reversal was pleasing to the eyes. Abraham looked at Alden, who was kneeling on the ground, and sneered, "I think you're all used to being officials. You think that everyone has to bow down to you when you're outside, right? Even such a small and cute girl has to pour wine for you? Duke, please listen to me. Boo-hoo, he's so fierce. I'm so scared." Amy, who had been holding her cheeks and watching the show, suddenly turned around and hugged Meg's arm. She said cutely, tears glistening in her big eyes, "Don't be scared, don't be scared." Meg glanced at Amy. Since when did this little rascal become so good at acting? She was already putting on an act. "Look at how scared the little girl is. What are you trying to say?" Abraham kicked Alden to the ground and became even more furious. He already had a ball of fire in his heart, and this incident had made him even angrier. Now that Alden was here, he might as well find something to vent his anger on. Alden didn't dare to fight back after being beaten up. He didn't even try to dodge. Even his cries were muffled. The expressions of Joseph and the others changed slightly as they watched from the side. However, no one dared to step forward to stop or mediate. Given Abraham's status, even if they were officials of the Ministry of Justice, it wouldn't matter if they were beaten up. At most, His Majesty would scold them a little, but there was no way he would do anything to the Duke because of them. Alden had gotten himself into trouble because of his mouth. At least Abraham wouldn't beat him to death on the spot. Abraham was a little tired from the beating, so he stopped. He looked at Alden, who was lying on the ground with his hands covering his crotch, and said, "Today's incident is over. Let me tell you, from now on, this tavern will be under my protection. If any of you need someone to pour you a drink, come and find me. I guarantee that you'll be satisfied." Everyone quickly shook their heads. Who would dare to ask this fiend to pour a drink? Mag was also looking at Abraham with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He didn't think that Abraham would be so domineering after returning to his home turf. However, it was a good thing for Saipan Tavern to have the protection of a duke like this. "I didn't expect to be able to ride on his coattails so quickly." Meg nodded. It was naturally best that he didn't have to deal with some small problems personally. With Alden as an example, no one would dare to cause trouble in the tavern for a long time. "You wasted a plate of my pig ears salad. I'll take this one." Abraham took a plate of pig ears salad from the table. After thinking for a while, he took a plate of pig tongue salad. Joseph and the others naturally didn't dare to say anything. Little girl, don't be afraid. With Grandpa Fatty here, no one will dare to bully you in the future. Abraham strode over to the counter with a smile, completely devoid of his previous domineering demeanor. Yes, thank you, Grandpa Fatty. Grandpa Fatty is mighty and domineering. Amy nodded her little head and looked at him with admiration. Her little mouth was as sweet as honey. Hee. Abraham returned to his seat with satisfaction. He smiled and muttered to himself, this little girl's words are so nice. If only Boss Amy could speak half as well. Alden was helped up from the ground. Someone took out a silk handkerchief and wiped off the pig ears and red oil hanging on his face. There was still a clear plate mark on his face. It was green here and there was purple there. He looked quite miserable. Oh, I won't be drinking with all of you today. Alden was completely humiliated. His entire body was in pain, and he wanted to find a healing magician to heal him as soon as possible. Let me send Lord Alden out. An official helped Alden out. The others knew that Alden couldn't sit still, but they couldn't leave. If they left, wouldn't it be obvious that they were unhappy with Abraham? Abraham took a mop and cleaned the red oil on the floor so that the other customers wouldn't slip and fall. Joseph and the others looked at Meg in a different light. A mysterious tavern owner's daughter dared to call Duke Abraham Grandpa Fatty. Who was this guy? If I tell you, you'll be scared shitless. Meg's lips curled. He knew what these people were thinking. After Alden left, Joseph and the others drank with some restraint. Although they had good wine in hand, they didn't feel like drinking it. Abraham was drunk. Alone, he drank half a bottle of Moutai and ate 6 plates of appetizers. The Duke helped me a lot earlier. This meal is free of charge, Meg said to the butler who was about to pay the bill. The butler looked at Meg and nodded. Okay, I'll let the Duke know. Meg smiled as he watched the 4 big men come in and carry Abraham out. This was the benefit of a rich and powerful man going out. Even if he was drunk, there would be people to carry him back. After Abraham left, the half-drunk Joseph and the others also paid the bill and left. At 9:30, Meg sent the last drunk customer out of the restaurant. He flipped the sign hanging on the door and announced the end of business for the day. Mr. Mac, can we still go in and have a drink? An old man and a young man standing at the door asked Meg with a smile. Chapter 2034. After a few days of recuperation, Melante's injuries were almost healed. Moreover, he could eat the delicacies that Meg sent to him every day. The originally skinny Melante had gained a lot of weight. His complexion was rosy, and he looked healthier than before he was injured. However, because of this, he lost some of his ghost aura and looked like an ordinary old man. Come in. Meg naturally would not refuse their request to come in for a drink. Since Melante's injuries had recovered, it was time for him to continue searching for Joshua. He was a large-scale human radar. What would you like to drink? Meg closed the door and asked with a smile. Mr. Mac, the wine you gave me last time. My grandpa has been scolding me for days, saying that I wasted good wine, Noah said with a bitter face. Noah had a bitter look on his face. Because of that small pot of wine, he had received a lot of love education from his grandfather these days. Moutai, right? Have a seat first. I'll prepare some dishes to go with the wine. Meg nodded and turned to go into the kitchen. After a while, Meg came out with 3 dishes and a bottle of Moutai. Noah was being pulled by Amy to play with her knitting. You're so stupid. You can't even do this. Oh my God. It's not like this. You have to cross over first. You're so stupid. Not this one, that one. You're so stupid. Amy, who had no talent in knitting, finally found the joy of the game when she met Noah, who had no talent at all. It seems like I'm really stupid? Noah's eyes widened as he looked at the messy knitting in his hands and fell into deep thought. Melante crossed his legs and looked at Amy and Noah with a smile. He was just like an old man. He did not have the temperament of a big boss of the Ghost Clan. Old man, how's your injury? Meg opened the wine cork and poured a glass for Melante. It's completely healed. I can do whatever I want, Melante answered, but his eyes were completely attracted by the wine in the glass in front of him. This wine was extremely fragrant. Even though he had lived for 700 years, he had never smelled such a rich and alluring wine aroma. Therefore, after drinking a few drops of the remaining wine in the bottle that day, he could not forget about it until today. Earlier, when he smelled the fragrance of the wine from the street, he could not hold himself back and waited until the tavern closed before he came to ask for a cup of wine. "Come, let's have a toast." Meg could see that his mind was on the wine, so he was not in a hurry to talk about business. "Thank you for saving my life, and for your hospitality during this period of time," Melander said to Mag solemnly as he raised his wine glass. "You're welcome." Meg clinked glasses with him and took a sip. Melander picked up his wine glass and downed it in one gulp. This wine was sweet and soft as it entered the throat. Its mellow fragrance spread out in the mouth like a dense fog, causing one to sink deep into it. "Good wine." Melanti opened his eyes after a long time and let out a long sigh of satisfaction. He had never drunk such good wine in his life. After drinking a cup of wine, he felt a little lightheaded. A warm feeling rose from the bottom of his heart, and his whole body felt very comfortable. Meg filled his glass again and said with a smile, "If the old man likes it, feel free to drink. There's more wine." "Then this old man won't hold back." Melander picked up his wine glass and downed it in one gulp. He had not touched a single drop of wine during these days of recuperation, so his alcohol addiction was already difficult to bear. "I want some too," Noah said in a small voice, reaching out to grab the wine bottle. "Children don't drink wine. You're in charge of pouring the wine. Go get yourself some water." Melander raised his head and looked at him. "I'm already an adult," Noah argued. Melander curled his lips and said, "That's according to a person's age. In the Ghost Clan, you're only an infant. You're not even as old as Little Boss." Noah was speechless for a moment. Amy, who was drinking freshly squeezed juice at the side, had her eyes lit up. She looked at Noah with a smile and said, "Really? Then can I call you Little Brother Noah from now on?" "You can't." "Little Brother Noah." "I already said you can't." "Little Brother Noah, be good." Amy reached out and patted Noah's head. Then, she really took out a piece of candy and handed it to Noah. "I don't want it." Noah wanted to cry but had no tears to shed. Amy said with a serious expression, "This is plum candy. The sweet and sour. The super delicious. You definitely haven't eaten it before." "Really?" Noah looked at the candy lying in Amy's small palm and gulped. "Here, smell it." Amy tore open the packaging and leaned in front of Noah. The faint sour smell of plums wafted out. Gulp. Noah swallowed his saliva. It really was the sweet and sour taste of plums. "Here." Amy poured the candy from her palm into Noah's hand. After a moment of hesitation, Noah still tossed the plum candy into his mouth. The sweet and sour taste made his expression twist instantly. However, after he got used to it quickly, he found the taste to be quite fascinating. Amy looked at him with a smile and said, "Since you've eaten my candy, you'll be my little brother from now on." "Huh?" Noah's face was full of question marks. "Father said that you can't beat me, so just accept your fate." Amy was still smiling, but in Noah's eyes, it had become a little devil's smile, like father, like daughter. Although Amy was only 4 years old, she was Alex and Irina's daughter. Such a terrifying combination product must be someone with extraordinary talent. Otherwise, Crassus and Julian wouldn't have fought to take her in as their disciple. As for whether she was really more powerful than him, after coming to Rodu, he had already heard the news of her defeating an 8th-tier magic caster and becoming the champion of the magic caster tournament. "So, it's all a plum candy's fault that I've become your little brother?" Noah was a little sad. "Look up. It's okay, little brother she. Big sister Amy will take care of you in the future." Amy said maturely as she was very satisfied with this little brother that she had just taken in. Noah didn't have any doubts about that. This was a monster who could defeat an 8th-tier magic caster at the age of 4. She might even become a great magic caster before she was 10 years old. Moreover, She was a super second-generation magic caster who excelled in both close combat and long-range magic. Her father was the most powerful man in the world, and her mother was the most beautiful woman in the world. Really, even the princess of the Roth Empire couldn't compare to her. Of course, if he knew that the Archbishop of the Holy See was looking for her everywhere to be the saintess, he would definitely kneel even faster. As they drank, Meg didn't talk about anything serious with Melant. Anyway, if he talked about it now, he would forget about it the next day. So he might as well not waste his breath. After drinking half a bottle of Mautai, Melant collapsed on the table drunk. Meg put down the half-empty glass of wine in his hand and said to Noah, "Come over for breakfast tomorrow morning. We'll talk about it tomorrow." All right. Noah, who hadn't touched the wine, left with Melant on his back. Amy looked at Meg, who had closed the door, and asked expectantly, "Father, did I do well today?" "Yes, Amy did very well. I'll reward you with a big drumstick tomorrow." Meg nodded. The little fellow's acting today was so natural that no one would associate her with the fierce little boss who was collecting money with her hands behind her back. "Amy likes big drumsticks," Amy said with a smile on her face as she nodded her little head. Chapter 2035. Many changes had occurred in the City of Life recently. Many landlords and nobles had burned the slave contracts, allowing many elves to regain their freedom. Furthermore, some slave owners had given some land and property to their former servants, allowing them to establish themselves in the City of Life. Of course, not all elven nobles were willing to give up all their privileges and return to being ordinary. Hence, protests of various sizes began to appear in the City of Life and the Wind Forest. Elven slaves attacked the nobles' warehouses and territories, snatching their slave contracts in an attempt to end their lives as slaves. Meanwhile, the night elves began to become active, secretly helping the slaves fight for their freedom. This movement was like a raging fire that instantly engulfed the Wind Forest. It was already out of control. To everyone's surprise, Helena didn't intervene at all. In fact, the guards didn't even provide any help to the slave masters who were asking for help. In the Starry Cave, High Priestess, all the major families have been robbed and slaves have escaped. Please order the guards to attack and capture those rioters. If this continues, the Wind Forest will really collapse. A middle-aged elf looked worriedly at Helena, who was sitting on the high platform. There were a few other elven nobles in the cave, and they were also looking at Helena worriedly. The Wind Forest system was collapsing, and Helena, who had single-handedly built this system, was ignoring this terrifying movement. Helena was silent for a long time. She slowly turned around and looked down at the elven nobles and lords below. Her gaze was cold and had a hint of mockery. The elves all looked away and lowered their heads. "If you had worked hard and fulfilled the agreement I made with you back then, and were absolutely loyal to Her Majesty and the elven race, this wouldn't have happened today. I've thought it through these days. It's not my fault, nor is it the system. It's because I chose you greedy fellows back then. Since it's your fault, someone has to bear the consequences to appease the anger of our people." Irina's cold voice echoed in the cave, and a wall of light rose up from the entrance of the cave. "Plop! High Priestess, please forgive us. We're loyal to you and the elven race. Please spare us, High Priestess." The elves in the cave immediately fell to their knees and begged for mercy. "Save those words for when you apologize to your brethren." Helena waved a hand, and 2 teams of guards stepped forward to tie up all of the elves present. The sound of begging gradually disappeared outside the cave, and the starry cavern mansion soon regained its tranquility. "Heh, cutting off your arm to survive, you really don't hesitate at all." A chuckle sounded in the cave, and a figure wearing a silver dress slowly walked in from the entrance of the cave. "I can do anything for the elven race, let alone getting rid of a few vermin." Helena looked at Irina, who had stopped in her tracks. Irina said mockingly, "Then you should commit suicide first to atone for your sins. After all, these vermin were specially selected and fattened by you. Now you're using them as scapegoats." This method is so inferior that it doesn't seem like something a high priest would do. Helena wasn't enraged by Irina's words, and she replied calmly, I've given my all for the elven race, and I have a clear conscience. Whether it's right or wrong will be left for future generations to judge. But now I have to lead the elf race into the next stage. You've already lost that right. I'm still standing here, and no one is more qualified than me. I'm going to make the elven race great again, Helena said confidently. Irina said coldly, back then, our brethren chose you and Her Majesty to lead them out of the dark era. In the past 100 years, you've plunged most of our brethren into an even darker era. Now everything is over, and our brethren have woken up. However, most of them have chosen to stand against the system you're so proud of, yet you still refuse to admit your mistakes. What right do you have to talk about making the elven race great again? This time, I'll choose a ruling class that will satisfy them. Even if Her Majesty were standing here right now, she would still stand on my side. Helena's brows furrowed. You're wrong. The elven race doesn't need a ruling class. What can make the elven race great again isn't some powerful guards or impenetrable fortress. What can make the elven race great again is freedom, equality, and the determination of all elves to protect the wind forest. A magic caster's staff appeared in Irina's hand, just like what you're doing now. Irina looked down at Irina. I'm very surprised that you didn't bring Alex with you this time. That's my business. I don't need him to do anything for me, although he's already done enough for me, Irina said calmly. You're the most talented elf we've seen in the past 1,000 years. You once had the chance to lead the elven race to a greater future. The Queen and I have high hopes for you, but you fell in love with a human and even gave birth to a bastard child with him. This is an unforgivable betrayal. Helena's face was filled with anger. That's a bit too much for you to care about. Irina smiled. Furthermore, meeting him is the greatest fortune of my life. As for that child, it's the best gift the God of life has given us. Actually, I sometimes think that maybe it's because you've never met a man who loves you in your life that you've become such a paranoid old woman. You talk too much. I'm here to fight you, not to argue. Irina interrupted Helena. She took a step forward with her magic caster staff and disappeared on the spot. Chapter 2036. Meg sensed Aziz's aura and went up to the roof. He saw Aziz swooping down and Irina lying on its back. Are you hurt? Meg hurriedly carried Irina down from Aziz's back. He didn't see any obvious injuries on her body, and her breathing was still stable. She was just unconscious. Aziz, go out of the city first. Don't go too far. Stay at the same place, Meg instructed Aziz. Aziz nodded. It flapped its wings and disappeared into the sky. Meg carried Irina downstairs and gently placed her on the bed. Did she go to fight? Meg looked at Irina, who was still unconscious, and said in his mind, System, help me check if she's hurt. Is her life in danger? Irina, female, 30 years old, elf, physical condition, overuse of magic. Many soft tissue injuries have been repaired. Body in a protective dormant state. Nothing serious. The system's report quickly appeared in Meg's mind. Then she should be fine after sleeping. Meg nodded and covered her with a blanket. The wind forest was Helena's home ground. In fact, it was also Irina's home ground with the help of the Tree of Life. As for the result of this battle, he could only ask Irina when she woke up tomorrow. Roduin, the church's main hall. Pope, we don't know where the saintess is. What should we do? The archbishop asked the Pope. The Pope smiled and said, Don't worry about this. God has his own plans. She didn't come because it's not time yet. But now that the devil has appeared and bewitched the world, even the second prince has been bewitched and controlled. God hasn't given a decree yet. The archbishop said hesitantly. God has already given a decree. The saintess is the most important existence to solve this catastrophe. The Pope shook his head slightly. Find her, persuade her, and let her lead the church to solve this catastrophe. Protecting this world is our most important thing now. But she's a half-elf after all. I'm afraid, Your Majesty. The Pope looked at him meaningfully and said, You must remember that the Holy See has never existed for the sake of imperial power. When we first established imperial power, it was only to better protect the human race. August tribe. An orc looked at Oster anxiously and said, Chief, more than half of the orc tribes that originally belonged to us have defected to the Fok tribe. If we don't do anything, I'm afraid the Fok tribe will have the final say among the orcs in the future. Oster, who had lost an arm, frowned. What can we do? That orc choked. This time, the Fok tribe had helped the other tribes and gained the favor of many tribes. Meanwhile, the August tribe had missed the initial opportunity. Now that the other tribes were siding with the Fok tribe, there wasn't much they could do. Unless we kill Connie and plunge the Fok tribe into chaos again, or we side with the August tribe. Oster had a cruel smile on his face. But Chief, the orc wanted to say something but stopped. Oster waved his hand and said, I've made up my mind. If we don't get rid of Connie, the August tribe will never be able to rise again. In the north, above the vast snowfield, a frost dragon slowly glided over the snowy plains, its gaze sweeping across the ground. Father, where are you? The heart-wrenching groan reverberated in the air, but there was no response. Meg made a pot of Buddha jumps over the wall for Irina overnight. When she woke up the next morning, she had a bowl of porridge first, and could drink the Buddha jumps over the wall that had just been stewed. So extravagant? Irina ate the abalone in small bites as she looked at Meg in surprise. Meg shrugged helplessly and said, You don't want me to fight with you, so I can only do logistics. Irina curled her lips and said, It's not like we can't beat them. You don't have to bring me along. Meg looked at her seriously and said, Anyway, if you fight again, you have to bring me along. Even if I don't fight, I can stand guard at the side for you. Okay, Irina agreed casually. Amy lifted her head from the bowl and also said seriously, You have to bring me along too. I can fight very well. How many do you want to fight, Irina? Irina tilted her head and asked with a smile, Isn't 10 too few? Amy asked, Normally, there should be at least a few dozen. Meg listened to the conversation between the mother and daughter and lowered his head to eat his porridge silently. She really didn't give men a way out at all. Irina didn't say much about the situation last night. She only said that Helena's injuries weren't lighter than hers and would probably stop for a while. However, the revolution and uprising in the Wind Forest had already reached a critical point. Helena wanted to take advantage of the chaos to select a new batch of ruling class and change their skin to continue the class rule. This was something that Irina would never agree to or allow. Meg was a complete newbie in this aspect, so he didn't give her any suggestions. Not long after, Noah and Melander also came. After breakfast, Meg and Melander confirmed the direction of their search. Their primary goal was to find Josh, and then follow the clues to find the devil that escaped from the seal. Compared to that, everything else was trivial. Once those sealed devils were released, the Norland continent would welcome its doomsday. Amy passed the bowl in her hand to Noah and patted his shoulder as she said, Follow me, and I'll let you do the cleaning. I won't mistreat you. Noah? Melander, who had recovered, would continue to search for the demonic aura with Rodu as the center. After this incident, Meg wasn't sure if Josh was still in Rodu. Apart from Josh, how to overturn the Edward family's rule over the Roth Empire was also a problem that Meg had been thinking about recently. In order to spread the Chaos City model to the entire Norland continent and completely solve the problem of racial wars, they would have to deepen the reform of the various races that were originally fixed. With Andre's current centralization of power, and Sean, who might inherit the throne in the future, it was obviously impossible for them to do that. What they wanted was to conquer the entire world and become the monarch of the Norland continent, making all the races submit to them. In comparison, even letting Vanessa be the queen as a transition is not a bad choice. Meg was deep in thought. Of course, overturning an empire wasn't a small matter. The difficulty level was much higher than killing Josh. However, there was good news today. Meg's faith points finally exceeded 100,000 on the third day of the release of the All Cuisine magazine. Meg's path to becoming the god of cookery had also increased by 2 levels. Congratulations, host, for obtaining the reward, Pasta Experience Bag. Congratulations, host, for obtaining the ability, Spiritual Control. Congratulations, host, for obtaining the item, Mysterious Rolling Pin X1. No pop-up window. Chapter 2037. Meg was a little overwhelmed by the system's continuous mission rewards. It was as if he had received an unexpected windfall, or rather, a considerable amount of after-bed income. Meg opened the large pasta gift pack. There were soup dumplings, shaved noodles, hot dry noodles, and fried rice noodles in chili oil, for rather comprehensive pasta dishes, and the fried rice noodles in chili oil were Meg's favorite. These 4 pasta dishes could make their breakfast more sumptuous and provide more choices for the guests. For example, when they didn't feel like eating, they could have a bowl of hot dry noodles or 2 steaming soup dumplings. The system was surprisingly generous. Then Meg checked the so-called mind control skill. It sounded like a shameful skill that could compete with time stop. Fortunately, it fell into the hands of an upright person like Meg. However, after a deeper understanding, it was more of a temporary stun skill than a mind control skill, as well as a strong immunity to mental skills. That's it? That's all time control is? It's far from time stop, right? Meg was a little disappointed. However, this was an upgradable skill. As long as the host's mental strength was strong enough, the skill could become more powerful. Of course, Meg was more concerned about the immunity to mental skills. When he could slash the whole world with a kitchen knife, the only thing that posed the most threat to him was the Great Old Ones. And mind control was the ability that the Great Old Ones were best at and the most troublesome. Even the current Meg was worried that he would fall for it if he wasn't careful. Tentacle monster plus mind control. Look, this kind of natural abnormality was so invincible. As for the mysterious rolling pin, it was actually a wooden club that could be big, small, waterproof, and adapt to all kinds of situations. Of course, Meg didn't know why the system had to specifically mark it as waterproof. However, with so many pasta dishes to make, the rolling pin was a basic tool and indispensable. After breakfast, Amy suddenly said, "Father, Mother, Sister, and drew a picture book yesterday. I'll show it to you." "Oh, really?" Meg was a little surprised, and smiled shyly and nodded. Irina looked at and expectantly. "Has and learned how to draw? I'd like to take a look." "I'll go get it." Amy turned around and ran upstairs. Soon, she came back down with a sketchbook in her arms. There was a beautiful mermaid on the cover of the album. She had a huge and colorful blue fishtail, red wavy hair, and a beautiful face. One could even see some resemblance of Gina. She leaned against the reef, and the rippling ocean spread out. The story of the mermaid. This was Anne's favorite fairy tale. Wow. Meg's eyes lit up. This was drawn by the mermaid. Unfortunately, he was uncultured. She could walk the world with the word, pretty. It's much better than the cover of most of the albums I saw the other day. It's drawn very well. Irina also praised. Meg took the album and flipped it open. It was indeed the story of the mermaid. The rippling ocean, the gorgeous ships sailing on the sea, the flying seagulls, the dolphins leaping out of the sea. Whether it was the scenery or the characters, they were all drawn very well. If there was a flaw, it would be that the storyboard was a little weak, making the plot not look as smooth. But for a beginner, the flaws could not obscure the beauty. This level of completion was already shocking enough. Yes, on the second day of learning how to draw, Anne completed a complete version of the mermaid by herself. What was this? This was a genius, an amazing talent for drawing, as well as a tentacle monster's hand speed that all cartoonists envied. With this kind of talent, she was destined to become an excellent cartoonist. The drawing is very good. It's beautiful, interesting, and the story is well told. Meg looked at Anne with gratification, as if he had found an excellent child laborer. The smile on Anne's face became brighter, as if she had never been so happy before. Meg put down the album, looked at Anne, and said, "However, it would be great if we could add in a segment where the little prince cooks for the little mermaid. That would explain why the little mermaid fell in love with the little prince, and why she loved him so deeply." And tilted her head and thought. Her eyes gradually lit up, and she nodded with a smile, agreeing with Meg's suggestion. However, and quickly asked Meg in sign language, "What dish does the little prince want to cook? Spicy grilled fish?" Meg did not hesitate. And the others looked at Meg. "It's not very suitable." Meg thought for a while and said, "Then make braised pork." "Why braised pork?" Amy asked. Meg smiled and said, "Because the little mermaid has never eaten pork or seen a pig run. So, when she ate braised pork, she was shocked and fell in love with the little prince." But Gina's favorite is beggar's chicken. Irina raised her doubts. And then Amy nodded in agreement. Sister Gina loved to eat beggar's chicken. She even gnawed on the mud casing. This is a work of art. Letting the beautiful Miss Mermaid gnaw on the mud casing is a little unsightly. Meg shook his head. Of course, he was mainly worried that people would not be able to learn how to cook a high-end dish like beggar's chicken. Just adding a layer of mud casing to the chicken would probably cause many accidents. As for braised pork, it was indeed a simple and quick dish. Yes, after seeing the finished product that Anne had drawn, he had already decided to insert an advertisement in the Mermaid. A Whole Foods magazine had allowed him to level up twice and obtain many rewards. He had tasted the sweetness of success. So, he put a lot of effort into increasing his conviction. This was a proper after-sleep income. The ratio of investment to output was amazing. Meg's explanation sounded reasonable and successfully convinced the three of them, and decided to add a segment of the little prince making braised pork in the comic. Meg was very attentive to this. He specially demonstrated a simplified version of braised pork to Anne on the spot. At the same time, he madly hinted to Anne that this was the soul of the entire comic. It had to be realistic and detailed. It would be best if the audience could copy it through the comic. At the same time, he also tactfully pointed out some of the storyboard problems in Anne's comic. Meg was not a cartoonist, but he had grown up with all kinds of comics. His ability to appreciate comics was still online, and went upstairs to continue her creation. She was really a hard-working little cartoonist. "Is this also one of your plans to expand your influence?" Irina looked at Meg with a half-smile. Meg smiled and said, "I just want to add a core competitiveness to my child's comic. A competitiveness that no one else can imitate. Yes, a priceless recipe for braised pork." Meg wanted to use and to expand his influence while also giving Anne's comic a strong core. Chapter 2038. And went upstairs to continue painting. Irina's injuries weren't serious, but she was still a little weak. Thus, the family canceled their plans to go out, put down the hidden movie screen, and turned on the home theater mode. "Wow, this Neza looks like me. I also have the wind-fire wheels. But her master is so fat, just like that pig. Is that long white thing a snake? That's a dragon. Is Neza a girl? It's a boy. Isn't she born from an egg? Will the ugly duckling become like her? I don't think so. Ha ha ha." After watching 3 movies in the morning, Meg put away the giant screen to let the little girl rest her eyes. He got up and went into the kitchen to make lunch for everyone. Mag saw the waterproof rolling pin that could be sized on the shelf. It was golden, but there were no patterns on it, nor were there any words like the Rui Jingu Bang. It was a bit of a pity. Mag grabbed the rolling pin and murmured softly, "Lit lit little 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 dash." The foot-long rolling pin quickly shrank until it was the size of an embroidery needle. The great sage didn't lie to me. Meg looked at the little golden club in his hand and resisted the urge to stuff it into his ear. Even if he couldn't, he should be able to perforate his eardrum. "Big, big, big." Meg continued to whisper. The needle-sized rolling pin began to expand, and it soon grew to a height of 3 meters. It stood tall in the kitchen. Interesting. When needed, it can be used as a jack. Meg nodded. He shrank it back to the size of an ordinary rolling pin and put it back on the shelf. Up until now, he still hadn't figured out what was so mysterious about this rolling pin. This bewildering name was probably the most mysterious of all. Last night's wine. Abraham sat on the edge of his bed and allowed the beautiful maids to help him dress and wash up. He was still thinking about the wine he drank last night. He had to be carried home last night, and he drank until he blacked out. Based on his past experience, this morning should be very uncomfortable. Surprisingly, he slept until the sun was high in the sky. When he woke up, he felt refreshed and had a good night's sleep. "What's the name of the tavern we went to last night?" Abraham asked the butler who was waiting by the side. "Master, that tavern is called Saipan Tavern. It's on Romo Street." Butler Xiao Zhen replied. "Saipan Tavern?" Abraham pondered. "Master, I've prepared some porridge for you. Would you like to eat now?" The butler continued. Abraham stood up and looked at the butler as he said, "Their dishes should also go well with the meal. Send someone to buy me some dishes to go with the wine." "Okay." The butler agreed and turned to leave. Abraham suddenly stopped him and said, "By the way, if their house isn't open yet, then forget it. Be civilized." "All right." The butler smiled and replied, "This old servant will go personally." Meg had just finished cooking when there was a knock on the door. Meg put on his mask and walked to the door. He looked through the doorway and saw an old man standing outside. This old man looked familiar. It was the old butler who usually followed Abraham around. "Hello, what's the matter?" Meg opened the door and went out. "Sorry to disturb you, boss. My master likes your dishes very much and sent me to buy some from you. I wonder if it's convenient for you?" The old butler said with a smile. This old glutton really knows how to eat. Buying dishes from a tavern is not something an ordinary person can do. Meg raised his eyebrows slightly. However, seeing that Abraham stood up for Amy last night, he still said, "The tavern only opens at night, and the cold dishes are not ready yet. However, there are still some drunkard's peanuts. Wait a moment, I'll go get some for you." "Okay. Thank you very much," the butler said quickly. After a while, Meg came out with a wooden box of drunkard's peanuts and handed it to the butler. "Boss, how much is it?" The butler took out his money bag. "Last night, your master helped our tavern out. These peanuts are a little token of my appreciation." Meg shook his head with a smile. "I can't accept this. When the master heard that you didn't accept the money last night, he already reprimanded me. If he knows that we are taking for free outside, he will drive me away." The old butler took out a silver coin and handed it to Meg. "Keep it. The master likes your dishes. He will definitely come again in the future." Meg tossed the silver coin in his hand and watched the old butler get into the carriage and leave. He turned around and went back into the tavern. This man is really unpredictable. He can even get close to Duke Abraham. What is his identity? Eiffel peeked through the half-closed window on the second floor of the Titan Tavern across the street. "Miss, what are you looking at?" The maid's voice came from behind. Eiffel was shocked. She quickly reached out and closed the window. Her face flushed red. She coughed to hide her embarrassment and said, "The window is a little open. It's a little cold. I'll close it." The young maidservant did not suspect anything. She put down the food box in her hand and took out the hot dishes that had just been bought. She said, "Miss, I heard that the business of the tavern opposite was very good last night. Moreover, their wine is very expensive. A customer has to spend at least 1,000 copper coins." "Yes." Eiffel replied absent-mindedly, "Miss, why don't we raise the price of the wine? Our customers don't even cost 100 copper coins." The maid was puzzled. "Idiot, our customers don't have much money. 10 copper coins for a cup of wine is too expensive. Raise the price? If we raise the price, we won't even be able to maintain this small number of customers." Eiffel unhappily stretched out her slender fingers and flicked the maid's forehead. "I'm just saying." The maid felt the pain and held her forehead. She felt wronged. Eiffel rolled her eyes and said, "They dare to sell a bottle of wine for 2,000 copper coins. That's because their wine is really good. What are we going to do? Then we will also sell their wine." The maid pouted. "Give you to the owner of the tavern opposite and exchange wine with him?" Eiffel laughed angrily. I. The maid seriously thought for a while. "If that owner wants me, this servant is willing to sacrifice myself." Eiffel. "I mean, he definitely won't want me." The maid quickly shook her head and looked at Eiffel again. "However, if it's Miss, I think he definitely won't be able to refuse. In this world, who can refuse Miss?" "I'm sorry, there's one across the street." Eiffel sighed in her heart. She had already been rejected once. There was no other reason. He had an even prettier one at home. Women were too difficult. Chapter 2039. News of Alden of the Ministry of Justice being beaten up by Duke Abraham in a tavern on Romo Street spread like wildfire in the bureaucracy. The dreams of countless officials were realized in a small tavern. This little-known tavern also became a new place for many officials to meet and have a drink in the evening. Romo Street had been desolate for many years, but it was still their youth. In those years, they stood in front of small houses with red lights on, showing off their beauty to the passing customers. How were they now? Peanuts with porridge? Abraham looked at the drunkard's peanuts in the wooden box and smiled. He then picked up a peanut and threw it into his mouth. The spicy and crispy peanut instantly activated his taste buds, and then he had a mouthful of warm seafood porridge. Perfect match. Abraham had to down 3 bowls of peanut and a mouthful of porridge before he finally finished his breakfast and lunch, though he still hadn't had his fill. "Master, there are rumors outside that you invested in this tavern." The old butler handed him a silk handkerchief and said. Abraham wiped his hands and smiled. "The owner of this tavern is quite interesting. Let them spread it, it will save him some trouble." "Okay." The butler nodded. "Prepare the carriage, I'm going to the palace." "Are you going to see His Majesty?" "No, I'm going to pick up Vanessa. No need to prepare fancy clothes." Abraham walked out of the door. "She will definitely like the dishes in this tavern." "Master, bringing the princess to a tavern. Is it appropriate?" The butler muttered. "What's inappropriate? We're going for the food." Abraham smiled. Before opening hours, there were already more than a dozen customers waiting outside Saipan, and most of them were officials in official robes. Of course, it wasn't that they came early to get a seat, but that they didn't know the opening hours of the tavern and came early. "Wow, look at that tavern. It's not even open yet, and so many officials are waiting. Yes, it's really enviable. Our Romo Street hasn't seen such a scene for many years. I heard that this tavern might be opened by Duke Abraham. These officials have ulterior motives. No matter who opened it, it's a good thing for our Romo Street. We've finally seen some fresh water." The merchants on Romo Street gathered together and looked at Saipan Tavern with envy as they whispered to each other. No one would have thought that this tavern would gain the recognition of so many customers in just a few days. Meg didn't expect the pub's popularity to increase so quickly. After dinner, he rested for a while. When he opened the door, he was almost shocked by the customers standing outside. "Please come in." Meg opened the door and welcomed the sulky-looking adults in. If this tavern wasn't related to Duke Abraham, I would have scolded the owner for making an old man like me stand outside for so long. Vanessa also noticed Amy, who was sitting behind the counter. The little girl was wearing a cotton dress, and her short legs were dangling by the side of the chair, swaying gently. She looked extremely cute. Beside her hand was a round, black and white pet. It was lying on its back and snoring. It had a round face and big black circles under its eyes. It looked very cute. "Hello, pretty big sister," Amy said to Vanessa. "Hello, so obedient." A smile also appeared on Vanessa's face as she patted the belly of the sleeping pet. "It's so cute too." Ugly Duckling opened its eyes a little to glance at her before tilting its head and continuing to sleep. Amy nodded and said, it's just a little dumb. Everything else is pretty good. What kind of pet is this? Is it a magic beast? Vanessa asked curiously. It was so cute, just like little boss's cat. Ugly duckling. It would be great if she could have one. Amy shook her head and said, this is a panda, not a magic beast. It's just an animal that makes a living by acting cute. Abraham chuckled and said, acting cute can make a living? Amy tilted her head and then said pitifully, Grandpa Fatty, Amy hasn't eaten for 3 days. Can you give me some money to buy some bread? How much do you want? I'll give you all of it. Amy waved the money bag in her hand with a smile and said, see, acting cute can make a living? He carefully observed for a while, a little worried that they would guess his identity from the dishes. However, according to his observation, the two of them were obviously more interested in the food. After eating and drinking to her heart's content, Vanessa's complexion and mood seemed much better. Isn't this a little inappropriate? Vanessa pointed at the bowl in front of her. Abraham shook his head with a smile and said, it's okay. I've already told the boss. We'll clean up our own bowls later. Hee, Uncle Abraham is still the best. You always think of me when you find something delicious. Vanessa looked at Abraham gratefully. Of course. Abraham patted his chest with a matter-of-fact expression and said, as long as I think it's delicious, I definitely won't forget you. Vanessa looked around and leaned closer to Abraham and whispered, then can I take a portion home? You're still not full? No, it's just that Mother hasn't had much of an appetite recently, and I want to bring some appetizers home for her. Vanessa shook her head. All right, then I'll go pack one for you. Abraham stood up and walked to the wine cabinet. It's a total of 264 copper coins. Amy had already done the calculations. I also want a bottle of Moutai wine and a portion of each of the 3 side dishes, Abraham said. All right, please wait a moment. Meg acknowledged from the kitchen, and soon came out with the 3 side dishes, as well as a bottle of Moutai from the wine cabinet, and handed it to Abraham. Thank you, boss. You can use the rest to buy candy for the children. Abraham took out 3 dragon coins and handed them to Amy. Thank you, Grandpa Fatty. Amy happily accepted the dragon coins. This was super valuable money. Goodbye, little friend. Vanessa smiled as she bade farewell to Amy, and stroked Ugly Duckling as she did so. Duke Abraham must have a special relationship with the boss of this tavern. Yeah, even Princess Vanessa is so close to that little boss. You can't mess with this little girl either. Not to mention the little girl. Even that round thing can't be messed with. Abraham and Vanessa's actions were seen by the customers present as proof that they had a good relationship with the tavern. Meg was quite happy with this misjudgment. It was better to avoid trouble. Felt great to have someone backing him up. Vanessa was big enough to protect him. Oh, it was high enough status. There were 3 princes in the Roth Empire, but only 1 princess. Everyone knew that His Majesty doted on this princess the most. No one would dare to offend her. Take care. I won't see you out. Meg helped the last drunk customer out of the tavern and handed him over to his coachman before closing the tavern's door. Phew. Meg heaved a long sigh of relief. He actually felt a little like he had just finished working at Amy's. Are you looking for a smart waitress? Irina said with a smile as she walked down the stairs. You don't say. I really want to hire one. Meg nodded honestly. She worked around the clock, ordering and serving the dishes. She also had to work in the kitchen to prepare the dishes and occasionally respond to the strange requests of the customers. He was really tired. Do you think I can do it? Irina pointed to herself. You can't. Meg shook his head with a frown. You're destined to be the lady boss. It's such a waste for you to be a waitress, Meg said seriously. Collecting money is quite suitable for me. Irina sat in front of the counter and began to count the day's income. Meg heaved a sigh of relief for the customers. He was mainly afraid that Irina would hit the customers' faces with the cold folding chair for no reason. If things didn't go well, someone might die. Father, there's a meteor shower in the sky. Amy suddenly ran down the stairs and stuck her head out as she exclaimed in surprise. Meg smiled. If there's a meteor, you can make a wish at the meteor, and it will come true. Really? Amy's eyes lit up. Of course. Amy can make a wish before the meteor disappears. Meg nodded with a smile. Then I'll go now. Amy turned and ran upstairs. Meteor, please bestow upon me a delicacy that I can never finish nor get tired of. The falling meteor swayed, and there were signs of it flying back. Host confirmed. Life experience system binding. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.